The second era of Russell T Davies has well and truly begun because despite us talking right now in November 2022 and David Tennant's 14th Doctor's 60th anniversary special is not kicking off until November 2023, his 14th Doctor has had their very first story released very recently, in a sense. So while we're still a year out from the David Tennant, I don't even know what to call them, guys. Like 60th anniversary special, it's not right because there's going to be 3 of them. It's going to be a 3-hour thing all up. You know, I'd like to call it a mini-series because 3 hours of British television put together, that's, you know, people often call those mini-series. And I think people keep regarding these 60th specials as something slighter than I get the sense they're intended to be, but no one's using the mini-series phrase from the actual promotion, so I guess I'm on my own there. So, anniversary specials, it is, I suppose. Would you guys agree that's the terming here?
Yeah, I mean, the timing of when they're broadcast relative to each other, I think, is also relevant too.
Yeah.
If they're spread out, then it'll be more specials-like, whereas if they're all together, then it would feel more miniseries-like, if you see what I mean. I think it's a pretty trivial distinction, though.
Yeah, but that's Doctor Who fandom for you.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're a year out from those, but we're well and truly out of the Chris Chibnall era now. It's over. It's in the past. Tennant is back where he belongs, many might think. He's an incumbent Doctor again. And aside from this surprise first 14th Doctor story that's out now, there are a couple of other topics I think right now we're at an interesting vantage point to discuss. Right now we're in the early days of RTD2. So it's myself, Neo from Australia, along with my friends Ingiga from England and Einarr from England as well. And we're going to be discussing that first 14th Doctor story, the story itself, and also why it exists and what it means for it to exist. And we're going to talk about expectations and hopes and fears for the 60th miniseries, specials, whatever you want to call them. We're going to talk about Russell's reasoning behind decisions made with Jodie Whittaker's regeneration into David Tennant. Can we call it Costumegate? Is that what it should be called?
I mean, that's just a name I invented for it. I don't know if actually if people are going to call that in general. I don't know if it's that serious.
Costumegate.
I'm sure it'll catch on.
Yes, it will. It will. Costumegate. We'll also discuss some messaging and positioning of these this very liminal pre-Ncuti era. We'll discuss the big D word, Disney, everything that's going on there, and a bunch of other topics bubbling up in these early Russell T Davies era 2.0 days, including this furor, this future furor over Tennant being billed as the show's future, and the variety of reactions to that, because not everyone's happy right now, are they? Some people are overjoyed. Some people are, you know, kind of neutral, kind of pleasant enough, not that fussed one way or the other. And some people are super cross, which I think is really interesting, especially because Russell's second era is going to span at least Tennant and Ncuti, but there's not really a unity here. There's an interesting split. Some people seem solely excited about the Ncuti era and not this liminal new Tennant era, and maybe there are some people the other way around as well. So, to start off with, I didn't really mention what this first 14th Doctor story actually is. Do either of you want to explain what's actually going on here?
I dare say, would the full title of this be considered a spoiler for the first chapter? That's the question.
Yes, but I mean, how many pages is it?
It's 6, I think. 6 pages, yeah.
I don't think it's a huge amount of content to spoil, especially given what the spoiler is. So,
Yeah.
the liberation, aka liberation of the Daleks. Yes, I'm not concerned with spoilers about this because I think anyone with an interest in this isn't going to go, there's Daleks in a Doctor Who comic story. I'm not going to buy Doctor Who magazine now. My experience has been forever destroyed and tarnished. How could anyone tell me there's going to be Daleks in a magazine story with Doctors Who in it?
If anything, it's almost more of a potential spoiler for the 60th if it raises a question about whether this Doctor will or will not encounter the Daleks in that. But I'm sure we can get into that later on. But I think that raises some interesting questions.
Yeah, so it's a 6-page-ish comic that's going to be in 13 parts. So this gap between the end of Chibnall's era and the start of the Tennant specials, this is one of the things filling the gap, this 13-part comic. And the comic's covering an hour in the 14th Doctor's life, the first hour of his life. So it picks up immediately after Jodie turns into Tennant, and then we have 6 pages of Alan Barnes storytelling. So It's an interesting little story. I think why it exists is perhaps more interesting than the story itself. So why do you think this is a thing?
I think there are a few rationales given in the magazine itself, or sort of a few different ones you could kind of look at. One of them, I think, is just as simple as Russell Davies is a massive fan of Doctor Who magazine and wants to give Doctor Who magazine a sort of pride of place again in, I guess, the sort of ongoing story of the show. And we can already see that, I think, in the new issue, just from some of the other features, the kind of level of behind-the-scenes stuff already going into introducing the new team, all this kind of stuff. So probably it's just partly that he likes the thought of kind of bringing Doctor Who magazine back into the fold so much. And he's an avowed, established fan of Doctor Who magazine comic strips in the past anyway, isn't he? He's spoken before about how much he loves those. So I think there's a bit of that. But also he says, doesn't he, in the new issue, something about being keen on the strip as a way to establish that this is very definitely, a proper Doctor.
Yes, I love that. That's very interesting.
Yeah, rather than just a sort of a one-off trick that we're going to get in a TV episode, he's also getting, spin-off media and so on as well, straight out the gate.
I think Russell can say that as much as he wants. He can put out all the press releases as he wants, and I'm still going to keep seeing. I saw a post online yesterday where someone's saying, basically equivalent of, you fools, how can you not tell that this is just going to be an illusion and then Ncuti will be the 14th and blah, blah, blah. I see this no matter what he says, people are going to keep saying this up to, and a couple of people probably after the specials itself. I think it's kind of a fool's hope to get everyone on board with this. But, of course, it's going to work for a lot of people, this messaging. So I think that's great. With the magazine, like you're talking about, I read a lot of Doctor Who. I read a lot of Doctor Who magazine. And when Russell boarded it back in 2003-ish, it really... There was something Russell did in his first era of show running the show and the other shows. Crucially, not just... Because there were 5 shows in Russell's era, weren't there? There was Doctor Who, Torchwood, Sarah Jane Adventures, but there was also Doctor Who Confidential, the behind-the-scenes show, and there was Totally Doctor Who, the kid-oriented show, not the fictional kid one like Sarah Jane, but like the old Tennant's on and he's talking about crafts and whatever, stuff for kids. I think Russell kind of took it upon himself, this kind of remit to bring fans kind of behind the scenes. Like his production notes were, so much about that. And Doctor Who Confidential was really thorough in like, this is what the craft services are doing on this day, and this is what the VFX people are doing, this is what these people are doing. I think he really wanted to get people kind of on board the whole production, the whole behind the scenes of the show. I think this is one of his interesting differences with, how spoiler-phobic Chibnall often was, whereas Russell kind of wants to push everything at you. A different sort of approach. So I think he really brings the kind of magazine on side with him in a way that Chibnall, he lovely things to say in the magazine. He had his own lovely production notes, but it was a very different kind of relationship where I think Chibnall liked to keep things to his chest and kind of really treasure surprises, whereas Russell has this different relationship, I think, where he likes to bring people on board the behind the scenes a lot more. And I think we're already seeing that with, the comic is in the magazine, and then there are behind the scene pages on how the comic was commissioned and what it means for the comic to exist and everything. It's a really kind of, what's the word? It's a very kind of holistic way he's trying to get fans into the new era, I think. Does what I'm saying make sense there?
Yes. I think, you wouldn't expect a behind-the-scenes thing about the comic in the magazine. You might expect one of the writers or illustrators to tweet a fact or something about why, do you know what I mean? A normal comic in Doctor Who magazine. But yeah, a special feature about why it exists seems, going the extra mile.
We haven't really talked about what's in the comic itself. Again, I'm not... People should go buy the magazine and read it themselves if they want to experience it completely unspoiled. But it's 6 pages, so I think let's talk about what's actually in it. So, and because it's a comic, you can't spoil the art. We're not showing the art up here. The art's, it's a very, very, very visual medium. So please go and buy it and check out the art if you actually want to experience the comic for what it is. But anyway, it starts with Tennant's on the Forbidden Rock, that there's, some anger over the Doctor regenerating on, because what if someone goes on that rock now? Anyway, then he goes into Jodie's TARDIS, and so that's quite interesting, that imagery of we've got Tennant in his new but kind of old clothes in Jodie's TARDIS, and he kind of... Does he seem very caught up in being in this new old body again, or in regeneration in general?
He very much does not. I think he looks at his pan for about 2 seconds and he's like, oh, no, something's distracting me, off I go.
Yeah, it just gets on with it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's very interesting. In the behind-the-scenes thing in the magazine, the writer, Alan Barnes, says he originally imagined that they'd be talking much more about the regeneration itself in the comic, but the feedback he got back from Scott Hancock was, no, just go straight into the adventure, no messing about. Why do you think that was the direction from Scott Hancock there?
Well, I can only imagine, the idea of a Doctor having a face that he's returned to is something they want to explore in greater depth in the specials themselves, or in the mini-series, whatever we're calling it. And so that's why they don't want the comic treading on their toes for that.
Yeah.
Which, is a bit of a shame, but is understandable.
I think it's kind of billed as this unprecedented thing that, wow, the first story of a new Doctor is going to be a comic, before he even gets onto the TV. And yeah, like that is a very seminal thing, but kind of by nature, Doctor Who magazine is something you buy, whereas at least in England, you can watch Doctor Who, through the BBC. It's not a purchasing thing in the same sense. So they're never going to... It's such a fandom thing to kind of think, well, this is the first story of a Doctor. It's crucial that we read this, but they're never, ever going to make it vital, or even anything approaching necessary, or even anything approaching...
Relevant?
Yeah, relevant, yeah.
Yeah, because doesn't Russell even specifically say that there was at one point a line that might have referred to this comic, but it was cut, or something?
It was cut, yeah. Yeah, and that just makes sense, doesn't it? Because of course you're not going to... Well, we'll get into pay gating a little bit later when we talk about Disney, but of course you're not going to pay gate out vital content. You bring David Tennant back, you want the show to be popular. You want everyone to be watching it. You're not going to say, we've brought Tennant back, but you need to buy 13 copies of Doctor Who magazine to really understand what's going to go on in this first special. We don't want everyone watching this and understanding it. We want everyone buying 13 copies of Doctor Who magazine so they know what's going on here. Like, I understand why people think like that, because you get in your Doctor Who fandoms and your Doctor Who worlds, and all the linkages between, in-universe stories feel so important and all-encompassing. But sometimes you've got to pull back a little and actually think, in the real world, Russell doesn't need people to buy 13 magazines to watch David Tennant's return.
Barnes also mentioned in that special feature how another note he got was add more Daleks. And I think generally the impression that I get is that they want him to make it as explosive and spectacle driven and exciting as possible. And I think obviously the structure of the comic being 6 pages a month, you have to try and keep it interesting and just make sure enough is happening within that short space. I think the structure sort of lends itself to this just sort of blink from one chaotic situation to the next, and you doesn't really allow a lot of time to stop and introspect and be character driven, I suppose.
I think it's a kind of harmless contradiction of, on the one hand, wow, it's so seminal and so important that the first story of the Doctor is in the comic, but on the other hand, of course, it can't be that important because it's in a comic a year before the actual show comes out. Therefore, it's going to be fluff. It's going to be Daleks and football, and all little vignettes happening rather than some actual crucial, let alone character-y story. And that makes sense. I don't think it's a bad thing. I just think that's what it's kind of a big signifier of showmanship, I think, because, they were all drumming up about the new Doctor Who magazines doing something unprecedented, and it is cool, but also it's not important in the way that we kind of build it up to be initially. But I think that's just part of showbiz, and especially how Russell builds things up, and I think that's totally fine, because what's the harm?
I was going to say, I think the comparison with the Infinite Quest that Barnes makes there is quite a good one, because the same idea of, just following on from what Gig was saying, that it's these 6 pages, or the Infinite Quest was 3 minutes or whatever it was at a time. It's these very, very short, sweet little, it's almost kind of hedonistic, just throwing lots of kind of locations and explosions and monsters and so on at you as quickly as possible, and it adds up in piece by piece to this bigger whole. It's kind of similar sort of model, similar structure to that, which I thought was quite interesting. But again, sort of shows the relegation to sort of a bit of fluff, side material.
Yeah. The Infinite Quest, I never saw that as a kid in 2007, but I did see it years later as an adult. Any listeners who don't know what the Infinite Quest is, it was a 45-minute-ish animated episode with the 10th Doctor and with Martha, but it was released in weekly 3.5-minute segments on Totally Doctor Who, that kids behind-the-scenes Doctor Who series I mentioned earlier as one of the 5 RTD1 shows. Yeah, so that animated 10th Doctor thing was released over 12 weekly segments, and now this 14th Doctor comic story is being released over 13 monthly segments. Yeah, there's a definite comparison there. And like you're saying, Einarr, the writer Alan Barnes, who wrote both this comic and the older cartoon, speaks about that thing with serial structure where you're kind of writing for the greater whole of the story, the final stitched together version you'll eventually get, but you kind of need a hook and a crest for each individual component too. So yeah, very different form of writing than for a more standalone or more traditionally singular 45-minute episode or more standalone long-form comic or anything. Yeah, it's a different, maybe fluffier form of writing for sure.
I also think within the comic itself, as much as RTD talks about establishing this new Doctor as a real one because he's got the spin-off media and such, reading the comic didn't really feel like I was reading the Doctor as a character. It felt like I was just looking at a cardboard cutout, reciting some quite empty lines and just blinking into random disconnected situations. It doesn't really feel like there's much of a character there. I mean, he's really just doing generic Doctor stuff.
Yeah, Alan Barnes, I don't know. I mean, some of his... he's a very important man with Big Finish in particular. He's one of the real old-timers at Big Finish. He's high up in that chain, so he's been around forever. He's written a lot of stories. Had a big hand in those old, early 8th Doctor audio monthlies that I know Oliver and I often extol. So I've liked some of his work for sure, but he's one of those writers where, I mean, he's not Nicholas Briggs, but there's a lot of continuity, and I don't feel a great sense of character in the way I might from some other EU expanded universe writers. Would you guys feel the same way? Am I being unkind?
No, I think that's fair. I mean, like you say, I've enjoyed some of his work as well, and certain instances. But yeah, I think he does have quite a comic book sensibility, which, I mean, obviously he did write a lot of comics back in the sort of the 8th Doctor run. Did he do a lot of those? And Izzy Sinclair and stuff, I think.
Yeah.
So he did a lot of those, but even his audios often have quite a kind of, that they can often be quite a lot more, I don't know what the word is, sort of visual and kind of knockabout and kind of than some other writers. There's a lot of kind of whizzing stuff going on in the way that kind of makes me think of comic book energy. And that's obviously the case here with kind of, the sort of instantly thrown into, there's a Dalek saucer hovering above, Wembley Stadium and the World Cup final and all the rest of it. That just feels like a very comic book idea to me.
Yeah. He did kind of originate Charlie Pollard, but I don't want to get sidetracked. So he definitely has good points, but yeah, I wasn't surprised by how this story came across when I saw that he was writing it. There was one particularly weird moment, though, I found in the story. So the rest of the story, it's basically the Doctors, I was about to say the 10th Doctor, the 14th Doctor's at a historically important football match. He sees some aliens masquerading as humans. He kind of rudely unmasks them, and then Daleks show up at the football match, and that's pretty much it. Have I missed anything?
No, that's pretty much it.
Well, the TARDIS gets a distress call, which the Doctor sort of follows. That's how it starts, but that's pretty much the only detail I'd say you've missed out.
Yeah, the weird character thing to me, I mean, maybe this is I saw someone humorously describe this as the 14th Doctor's no chances. I'm that sort of man. Like no first chances rather than no second chances, because he just unmasks those aliens. I thought that was pretty invasive, pretty brusque, pretty rude. Why did he do that?
Seems like an attempt to try and convey that original 10th Doctor, I guess, imperiousness and, like you say, the no second chances thing, but in an extremely miniature format and as rushed as possible. And I guess it's a sign of maybe a slight problem with trying to write the 14th Doctor before he's had more than about 30 seconds of screen time, which is it's just going to revert to mini Tennant cliches, just rehashed, I guess, in ways that don't really have much context for them.
I don't get, what were the aliens doing wrong? So the aliens were just watching the football. The Doctor goes around and he watches old historically important things. And so these like pink cone-headed aliens are just checking out the football match, right? They're not doing anything evil. And then 14 goes over to him and he's like, you're not even wearing ties, tut, tut, tut. And he unmasks them and one of the aliens says, please, you're spoiling everything. And
now they'll see the real you.
They see the real you. Yeah. So he really does feel post-13 then in that sense, doesn't he? He's got her screwdriver there and he's being weirdly judgmental and making some very odd moral choices. But because it's so fluffy, I'm not actually reading this into, Scott Hancock conferred deeply with Alan Barnes to put out this, terrifying new characterization of 14 as more imperious than ever before. I don't think that's what happened. I just think it's some clumsy characterization like you get in EU stuff. But maybe I'm wrong. And then my impression is the Daleks whiz out at the end of this, and I'm guessing every month we'll get a little short, the bad guys whiz up at some interesting location in time and space, and 14 does something kooky that sounds diverting enough to me. I saw an interesting theory that maybe each strip of the comic will be like in a different regeneration year because of the one that this story takes place in. That would be a pretty fun way to take advantage of the 13 issues thing.
Yeah, so you'd have 66, 69, 74, and so on. Yeah.
Like the real world years, that regenerations happened in.
It'll jaunt through the last decades of the 20th century. Yeah, possibly. I guess, there's already kind of vaguely homaging the Cushing film, isn't it, for the strapline for the next episode, the next comic strip with the Daleks Invasion Earth 1966.
Bringing up the Cushing films, the old 60s, man, I don't want to use the term non-canon because there's so much I dislike about that, but I don't know, how would you describe the Peter Cushing films from the 1960s weren't they didn't seem part of the show that William Hartnell was in right now. They seemed adjacent to it, I guess you could say. These days, if they made them these days, they'd call them alternate universe, I suppose. If we're ready to get off the comic a bit, there's the Cushing films segue into something I wanted to talk about. Does anyone else have comic thoughts?
Well, just one thing. They mentioned in the behind-the-scenes feature on the comic that it's structured around having a cliffhanger every chapter, and I just feel like when you only have 6 pages for a comic, really what you need to do is fill like every page of it with interesting, fun things, rather than just sort of drag your feet until the last page. I think the latter leads to a maybe kind of stop-start experience, which is the kind of what I got with this first chapter. So yeah, my expectations are not astronomical for the rest of this.
Yeah, I'm not planning to convene every month with you guys to go over each strip. I think we've covered what it is and why it exists, and that's the most interesting thing about it right now. But who knows? Maybe it'll evolve in interesting ways. But with how Einarr brought up the Cushing films, there was something Russell T Davies said in this Doctor Who magazine that I thought was a really, really, really interesting point. He says, he's asked, does he think that like the Doctor Who comics are better when they're really closely linked to the TV series, because they're quite disconnected. And Russell says, I hope I'm not too didactic, because I think the strip can take all sorts of shapes, and they all work. I loved it way back in 1992, when characters from the New Adventures novels suddenly appeared in the strip, and the strip started in the 1960s with companions John and Gillian, who were never seen on screen. I remember when we came back in 2005, the Doctor Who magazine editorial team were delighted to welcome Rose, but understandably sad that they had to lose their own creation, Izzy. I was sad too. I loved beautiful, queer Izzy, and I hope unique creations like that can exist again. We'll find a way, so all forms are possible. And this is the really interesting point, Russell says. I think Doctor Who's spin-off media has always interacted with the TV show in fascinating ways. Take John and Gillian. They arrived in the TV comic about a month or so before Susan left on TV in the Dalek Invasion of Earth in 1964. So maybe slightly, the comic strip prepared the way in the eyes of children for companions to change before that had ever happened on television. Just like the Peter Cushing movies introduced the notion that other actors could play the Doctor before William Hartnell regenerated. So these things resonate, they're potent, let them interact and see what happens. So what RTD's kind of brought up there is this idea of how like the EU, the extraneous stuff that isn't the TV show itself, can actually preempt and kind of prime people and kind of seed ideas that the show might go on to do, and people might feel more amenable to them then. I kind of think it wasn't in the EU, but how Moffat had characters doing regenerations crossing gender boundaries a couple of times before the Doctor themselves actually did it. I think you could argue, and I think he has argued, primed people for it, rather than if they'd just gone in cold and turned the Doctor into a woman without having other Time Lords do that. I'm not saying his reasoning is like great there or anything, but the idea of priming people through kind of adjacent happenings, I think is really interesting. I hadn't quite thought of it in the way that Russell's talking about it there. What do you guys think of his argument?
I think because the spin-off content shows, when it's allowed to show alternative possibilities to stuff that's happening in the main show, I think just the nature of it as being sort of separate, I think it opens up imaginative space for stuff that could essentially be potentially be done with the show. So I think that's a good role for it to serve. Like, it's not necessarily going to, even if it's not preempting stuff necessarily, I think just by not being entirely beholden to what the show's doing, it can explore some space that might feed back into the show later. I mean, it's just a good thing to have, you know, let people do other stuff with the property and the IP.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sort of reminds me a little bit of kind of when people talk about, you know, does the media shape opinion or does the media reflect opinion? It's sort of the same kind of phenomenon in the sense that, you know, there's a constant push and pull of whether the spin-off media is, you know, sort of echoing and reflecting and kind of following in the footsteps of the main TV program, which obviously it is, you know, some of the time, and then the extent to which it's doing what we talk about here with kind of doing new things that then the program can go on to pick up on. And you know, it's kind of cycles of both, isn't it? I guess particularly through the Wilderness years, you get a lot of huge imaginative spread of canvas of new stuff that then when the program returns, it comes, it goes back to that well lots and lots of times and draws from some of that Wilderness year stuff. Maybe a bit less since 2005. Although I guess The Lodger grew out of a comic strip, didn't it?
Yeah, that's true.
The TV episode The Lodger. So, you know, you get things like that.
Although in this case, this strip seems to almost be defined by being the opposite, in the sense that they can't do character stuff. They can't, and the fact it's full of Daleks seems to almost suggest that maybe the episodes themselves won't have many Daleks. I don't know. It's like it's rather than being a parallel stuff that might feed back into the main show. It's like this strip is just defined by being stuff that is by being the. How to say this, like the inverse of what will actually come in the main show, in the sense it's just this space where it's enclosed in this bubble of not doing things that will tread on the main show's toes, if you see what I mean. And the fact it's coming before we actually have any real screen time for 14, the fact it's in this space before 14's character is really established or fleshed out very much, it really does feel like it's sort of stuck in this little box where it can't actually really feed into anything. It's just doing stuff that the show isn't, if you see what I mean. Yeah,
it's weird. It's like audios that have to, or novels that have to take place in the gaps between adventures for classic Doctors, except that here, like you say, it's before we've actually had the story in question, which is a kind of weird disjunct. And it's a little bit like as well the novels and so on that get written before the writers have really seen a huge amount of the character on screen, so they, as you say, sort of default to generic Doctor a little bit because they've not actually got to grips with the new incarnation yet. And
I think the way RTD talks about how the 14th Doctor is more real because we have the strip going, even though the standard for what the strip can contain is, you know, pretty low, all things considered. It's almost like saying you're a real Doctor because you have sort of content slop flowing, like irrespective of the standard of quality of that content or what it contains.
Yeah, I think of those EU stories like novels, comics, audios that were happening, particularly before Russell took over the show the first time in 2003, and there was stuff going on in there where, like, Jodie Whittaker's last episode in 2022 was still drawing from stuff that came from those Wilderness years. We talked in our discussion of it about 2 Paul Cornell ideas that felt like that kind of fermented up. Maybe it was a case of convergent evolution, but even if not the power of the Doctor, certainly in the Moffat years and Russell's first set of years, stuff from those wilderness stories was bubbling up all the time. Sometimes, very explicitly. Sometimes actual writers like Rob Shearman or Mark Platt were bought, and paid to incorporate some of their wilderness stories into the show. So when there's that kind of freedom, like we're talking about with the EU stuff, and it has that lack of constraints, it bubbles up stuff that can resound for, such a long, like even the Time War. I know Alan Moore was, even Classico itself. There's a lot of origin points for the Time War you can point to, but certainly the novels did a kind of version of that resounded a lot, and the Time War was like the underpinning mythos of the first decade or so of New Who. So big ideas can germinate from the EU, and it has a lot of creativity. I think there's a kind of irony when Russell took over the show, and I'm not really pinning it on him because I think it's more just a function of when you have a show in the 21st century functioning, there's going to be brand limitations. Russell, of course, saved Big Finish and is such a huge champion of the EU, but there is a constraint to the EU since the show came back on air, isn't it? It's like we're saying novels that are kind of preformed versions of companions because of how they have to coordinate with the show. The audios, I get the impression a lot of this was actually self-inflicted more than like a directive, but like the audios narrowed, I think, in some ways, at least with the Eighth Doctor stuff. Yeah, so it's a kind of, when the EU starts patterning itself on the show, because of course there's EU that takes place within the show, like the novels that have the companions, but even in things like the Eighth Doctor audios, they started patterning themselves on the show where, like, I don't know if they needed to necessarily. They might have needed to in a commercial sense, but like getting a companion that was patterned on after Rose and that sort of thing. It's just a funny kind of irony to me that Russell's huge champion of the EU, very sincerely, yet I don't think it's his fault or like directives he's doing, but I just think the nature of him making the show so successful means there's going to be brand limitations, and those limitations kind of constrain the EU in a way where it's harder for it to bubble up ideas that can then resound for decades in the actual show itself. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah,
probably. I think, you could argue that, we really need another wilderness years and another sort of total collapse of interest in Doctor Who to really get a kind of thriving ecosystem of extended universe ideas and debates and kind of about what the show is meant to be and the new direction and blah, 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 and you'd get all that for another 15 years and then that could influence the next iteration of the programme. But yeah, I don't know if we're going to see cancellation like that anytime soon. So
no.
Yeah, it's probably not going to happen.
Yeah, I thought we might have been heading there, but
for a hot minute there, yeah.
Russell to the rescue again, yeah. Maybe this is getting totally sidetracked, so I want to stop this. But maybe like fan fiction and fan projects, that aren't beholden to the brand directives are kind of the way to bubble up new ideas. Then, because I see there are plenty of those happening, and they can do what they want because they're not actually part of the brand commercially. So maybe that's the solution.
And maybe, God willing, one of those fans will become part of the show in like 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years.
Well, that kind of segues into something else I wanted to talk about. That actually segues very well. Thanks, Gig. Which is the people Russell's brought in for his second era, which, we're talking about, wouldn't it be great to get lots of new fans in and new voices in and stuff like that. And I know we just talked about Alan Barnes doing the comic. And of course, there's that big relationship going back with Alan Barnes and Doctor Who magazine, which obviously is a commanding huge part of, its history. So all that makes sense and everything. But because this new issue of the magazine went through, a bunch of people who were in Russell's new team. Of course, we already knew that, how to describe them, the very, very successful producers, Julie Gardner and Jane Tranter, and Phil Collinson, the old dream team of Russell's first era, the whole new Bad Wolf team that the whole show is being coordinated through now. So there's all that. It's the team has returned. But also, I don't know, I'm thinking how to phrase this. One of Chibnall's big directives, and possibly the most admirable thing about his time on the show, was he really wanted to widen not just the stuff in the show, which I think he had mixed success with, but people behind the show, like the directors in the show and the writers of the show and people behind the show. And I think he did that pretty successfully a lot of the time. Would you guys agree?
Yeah, I think so. Although I dare say maybe some of the contributions from the various writers that he brought in, I don't know if he was running a show where that was really sustainable. Because you look at series 12 and how many of the scripts in there were like co-written bodge jobs, and it's like I don't necessarily feel like with the kind of chaotic schedule that they were running, I don't know if the new writers were really able to flourish in the way that they might have otherwise.
At least I think his heart was in the right place, trying to get new voices and specifically trying to introduce a diversity of voices into the direction and the writing and, other behind the scenes roles. I think that is his best legacy, really, with the show. But what do we think of the team Russell's assembled here?
Well, one of the things that leapt out to me, and you sort of maybe slightly hinted at this already, is how various of the new team members, new crew members interviewed mentioned that their first episode, or the first Doctor Who episode they'd seen, was something like New Earth or The End of the World, or, post-2005 episodes anyway, which I think shows a little bit of an age generation shift. So that was one thing that leapt out at me, that, we're starting to get people working on the show now who maybe were 10, 15 in 2005. I mean, that's fascinating.
Yeah. What do you think of the new team, Gig?
Well, I mean, obviously we haven't seen, say, the writers for series 14 yet or anything like that. It's mostly, I guess it's sort of, but I think it doesn't really surprise me that a lot of the people who are going to be behind the cameras and such, working on the start of RTD2 and going into series 14, it doesn't surprise me that a lot of them are Welsh and sort of guys and white dudes and stuff. Yeah. I mean, it doesn't surprise me a great deal. I think, because at the end of the day, I think if RTD was, I think it's just unrealistic to expect some big tent approach from RTD, because he's doing this to get his mates back together. So I just think the idea that he'd be trying to push the boat out like Chib was is just unrealistic, isn't it?
But equally, it does feel a little disappointing, I feel, to see a mostly white team after years of Chibnall trying to, diversify the field, yeah.
It's kind of this double whammy of Chibnall, much as we've had issues with him, he did have some sort of legacy in the most literal way possible. I'm not getting to Costumegate quite yet, but Jodie's clothes literally melted away to do like a reprise of the 10th Doctor's clothes. And isn't that it's so metonymical for what's happened with the team here, which is, very largely a reassembly of the old team and then an addition of people who are very simpatico with that old team. And it's just a shame, because like the 13th Doctor's ending to me felt very, tag, you're onto the new adventure. And it's not we'll get into this is the future, but in a very immediate visual sense, that's not the future. That's the past that she turns into. And then I kind of, in a meta way, I feel like that's happened with the production as well. And as much as I really am fairly confident that these 10 episodes and then the Ncuti episodes are going to be television I enjoy a lot more and find a lot more to chew on over compared to Chibnall's era, I do think it's a shame that like some of what I see is the few good bits that Chibnall had going there, especially at the end, kind of melted away, and the era's just kind of been relegated or kind of voided in a way. And it's kind of I don't know, it feels a little bit, I don't know if wrong's the right word to me, but I wince a little at it. Like it's embarrassing, maybe. It just feels uncomfortable to me.
Yeah, there's a sense of giving up on the idea of trying to evolve things all that much. I mean, obviously not entirely, because there are like some, we've already seen some interesting contributions to the diversity of the show, like between Gatwa and Yasmin Finney's casting and all that stuff. Yeah, like that's all really interesting. Much. But yeah, again, when it comes to behind the scenes stuff, I think it's clear. RTD is back. He's running a business here. He's got like a. It's all about just getting it made, I think, and just sort of the finer, more beauteous concerns are maybe not quite at the forefront of anyone's mind.
Yeah, I hope it doesn't sound like I'm just a contrarian that's gonna, every year of Doctor Who I'm gonna yap and nag about. It's not true at all. I'm sure I'm gonna love so much of what's about to come, and I'm gonna chew on it in such positive ways. But that's when the episodes come out. We're not in that era right now. We're in this kind of mulling over phase right now. So this is the time for it.
In light of what you said about her clothes melting away and all that stuff, not to get onto Costumegate or anything, but do you think 13 is being overshadowed very quickly compared to maybe past Doctors?
Yeah.
I think yes and no. I think one of the things that people, or particular fans of the era just gone, were sort of grumpy about, I think, was just kind of how quickly the changeover of all the branding and the logo and everything happened. But I think, I might be wrong about this, but I think it was slower than the changeover to the Smith stuff in 2010. I think that was a faster, everything was pretty instant. So, I think it's fair enough that RTD wants to kind of come storming out the gate with as much promo as possible straight away, and he more or less kept his promise, didn't he? That kind of they wouldn't kind of do loads of promo while Jodie was still the incumbent, and now she isn't. That they can get on with it. But yeah, I sympathise with people for whom this era has been their space or whatever, or the thing they're kind of deeply engaged with, and it it feels like it's been sort of shunted to one side. I mean, kind of when something is part of your identity or whatever like that, I can understand that. But yeah, it is also the nature of the game, I think, somewhat. It
wasn't within Russell's power to make Jodie's Doctor more memorable or more beloved. That was in Chibnall's power.
Right. Yeah.
So I think while there's an unfortunate heir to some of this, but
yeah, I think 13 rather disappeared from her own show, circa series 12, I think is almost the bigger problem. To be replaced by a vehicle for exposition. She never got her Midnight, she never got her Heaven Sent, she never got her Time with the Doctor. Anything where the interiority of her Doctor and just her character and her performance was at the absolute centre of things. She was always just lost in this whirlwind of just sort of chaos and Daleks and stuff flying around. I think in a real sense, she receded from the show itself well before she actually regenerated and got replaced. But I also think another thing contributing to the jarringness of the handover is that the first episode with 14 is still so far away.
Yeah.
And yet we are already getting this deluge of 14 stuff. I think the feeling that RTD is trying to fill a vacuum is very tangible.
I almost think back to when Moffat originally was trying to convince Chibnall to take on the job, but Chibnall was going to do Broadchurch Series 3. And so Moffat thought, I don't want the show to be off air for forever until Chibnall's ready, so I'm going to do another series. I'm going to do Series 10, which is quite a really good series, all things told. So we're kind of in the inverse of that right now, where we are getting a big gap, where the show is not happening. And I think it's just, things have just panned out the way they've panned out. Like, I think Russell is being gracious. He says in the magazine, I don't think it's the place of incoming showrunners to tell outgoing showrunners what they want. And he's talking about how he was totally chill with however Chibnall wanted to do the regeneration, and he would have just played off, whatever he got given to him, which he did. And he was personally quite pleased the regeneration was outside. He thought that was a cool change. So I don't think Russell's really doing anything wrong. I just think, well, we'll talk about the costume thing in a second. If you're going to make the argument that's the place you'd make it. I don't think he's really doing anything ungracious. I think it's just the Chibnall era was what it was, and Russell's trying to make the show as popular as he can. And so there's some awkward moments between the kind of collision of that in this transitional stage.
I also think it's the disconnect between the two styles that you mentioned earlier. The fact that one style of kind of promotion and marketing and so on was quite spoiler-phobic and was quite reserved, and then to move from that to a sort of very, very ebullient kind of, hyper-energetic sort of style that is Russell. It just, if you're used to one, people kind of, who were particularly into the last era maybe were very used to it, to go to the other kind of probably does feel quite jarring as well, I expect.
I think it's really conspicuous to make the choice to stop doing 13 spin-off content the moment she's regenerated, even though the first 14th Doctor episode is not for another year. So the idea that we can't do 13 comics anymore, we have to do 14 comics, even though we've barely seen him and we barely know who he is. I think that's also like that rings out, I think, as something. The idea that we need to sort of have all this 14 reaffirming, reinforcing stuff, like when he's only had 20, 30 seconds of screen time. But at the same time, I think the element of familiarity with 14, the fact that he's played by Tennant again, and if you want to know what Tennant's Doctor is like, you can go watch all of those episodes he did. And even the branding is familiar, the diamond logo. I think the familiarity with all of it maybe precludes the need to take it slow, because they can just jump straight in and everyone will immediately know what's going on. So there's just all kinds of obvious advantages to doing it the way RTD is doing it. And yeah, I mean, it sucks for 13 fans, but them's the breaks,
What strikes me about it is we were kind of wincing, or, some people were laughing throughout 13's era after 2018, when the 10th Doctor started rearing his head in a lot of EU stuff, the comics between 10 and 13 and games, and then Time Lord Victorious all popped up. And it was like the 10th Doctor started interrupting her era before this was literalized, in the most dramatic of ways, where she literally turned into him. It's a very narrative kind of way I think this turned out. It's like he started popping up. He was like the Watcher, wasn't he? He started emanating throughout an era before he actually took it over. Yeah. We can't say we weren't warned.
Exerts just such a pull of gravity, doesn't it? The idea of the Doctor as David Tennant. That it's sort of, yeah.
And the fact that the tweet-alongs, the lockdown things during 13's era were so interested in celebrating older episodes of the show, and like the Files of Pompeii, for example, and like the fact that those events and that process of fans wanting to celebrate the old show directly, materially led to RTD and Tennant coming back and taking over the main show, I think is just, it's extremely telling, isn't it? I mean, that just says it all. The fact that RTD, Tennant and Tate were all involved in this thing just to, hey, let's celebrate a bit of Tennant Who. Let's go back, let's celebrate that. We all loved that, didn't we? And that just led straight to them coming back. I think that's pretty interesting, isn't it?
I think there's an elephant in the room here, which some fans ignore, or some have kind of learned to ignore, I think, in the interest of, fandom equality and their own personal favourites and everything. But people really, really like David Tennant. Lots of people. They like him more than other Doctors. Like it's true. There's no point denying it. I don't think it's interesting or gratifying to deny it. He's really, really, really popular. People really, really like him. He makes people happy. There's this kind of dirge sense, or this kind of funereal sense around, oh, we've brought him back, what a sorry, this march into the past. But that's the perception of like a minority of fans. For most people, this is joy. And that's what I think Russell is kind of commanding here. I keep seeing people get this sense, and I can see why they're thinking this, because when Jodie regenerates into Tennant, he's saying what? And he's very confused by, who he's turned into again. And there's some quotes in the magazine. I think Scott Hancock has a good quote. He says it's unusual, mysterious, the fact that the Doctor's Tennant again, and the Doctor's more than aware of that, perhaps even troubled by it. So I understand why people are thinking, oh, this is a bad thing, and maybe the miniseries will be interrogating it, and, this is all going to be, the Doctor should never become the past, and he's going to have to learn from his mistakes, and he's going to have to go and apologize for things that the original 10th Doctor era got wrong. I see lots of people keep thinking he'll regenerate with some flip on I Don't Want to Go, like Russell's brought Tennant back to reverse the iconic lines from his, celebrated final. It's a very fandom thing, I think, is going on, where we just kind of think that, oh, this must be a negative thing, or this must be a self-reflective thing. And maybe that's what's going to happen, but I'm extremely skeptical of that, because everyone loves David Tennant. This makes people happy. People are celebrating this. You go talk to non-Doctor Who fans, and most of them think this is great. Why would Russell be doing this to condemn it? Like, why? Like Gig was saying, the watch-alongs were like a joy, and Tate and Russell and David were all having joy with it, and the fans were all having joy with thinking over these episodes again. I don't see why we have this expectation, because we're bringing the past back. It's actually not going to be to share in the joy. It's going to be to reflect on it, and like a Twin Peaks 3 or Trainspotting 2 or the rebuild. I'm very skeptical of that being what we're actually going to get. But what do you guys think? Am I overly skeptical? I just think it's kind of this fandom impulse to like think, oh, bringing something back is bad. It's Star Wars does that. That's, we all shake our heads. How dare you bring things back and make people happy? We need to condemn this. But isn't that the opposite of what this is going to be? Tennant makes people happy. Russell's a showman. Why would this be a funereal thing? I
mean, I agree it's deeply unlikely that he's going to end with some sort of scathing, indictment of the whole enterprise of bringing, kind of like you say, this sort of becomes a massive critique of his own project. But I think Russell is very good at populism that is still a bit spiky about its own populism. So I can see that he would walk the... I mean, you know, it's obviously going to be fun, and it's obviously going to be joyous, and, you know, he's going to use the word a hoot about 6 billion times to describe Tennant and Tate being back, and, you know, there'll be all sorts of hilarity will ensue, I'm sure. But I would be surprised if there is nothing, if there is not something in the mix equivalent to those kind of moments in the first, you know, the original sort of 10th Doctor Tennant era, where even as the programme is kind of playing up how much, you know, you love him and the companions love him and so on, it is also deeply aware of his darker underbelly and, you know, the way in which he, you know, people who come too close to the Doctor get burnt and all that kind of thing. And I'd be surprised if there isn't something in there that is aware of its own, of the dangers of possibly of nostalgia, although, you know, that might be taking a bit far. But you know, something along those lines. I suspect he'll have something self-aware in there, even if it's not the point of the whole project. I don't know. It's just my instinct there.
Yeah, I imagine maybe there'll be a few things sort of smirkingly reflecting on it, but on the whole, I think it's characteristic of RTD to indulge in his own success and wonderfulness and everything. I mean, like, you remember, like, Journey's End, all the companions getting together to pilot the TARDIS, having a big love-in. End of Time, you know, the whole farewell tour, revisiting everyone. I think the thing is, RTD, like, when he knows he's popular and he's doing really well, and he will celebrate that, and he'll have a good time doing it. And I think fans have a tendency to, well, some fans, a minority of fans, still kind of have a grudge about the whole Tennant era and just the overwhelmingly exclusive popularity that it has to the exclusion of everyone else. The way that...
It was too mainstream.
Yeah, and the way that... I think there is something understandable about it, because when you love other Doctors who aren't Tennant, but you feel they're being overshadowed or kind of disrespected or looked down on for whatever reason, you know, you'll get bitter about that. And there was such outcry when it seemed like a BBC News article was kind of casting shade on Peter Capaldi and stuff like that. You know, fans get very, very sensitive about that stuff. And I think the show has maybe partially conditioned them to do that, because the show is always about passing the torch to some new people, some new hands, a new actor, whatever. So fans have got it in their heads that, you know, we need to refresh, we need to keep moving forward and, you know, improving ourselves and not self-cannibalizing. And to a certain extent, there's something understandable about that too, because when you self-cannibalize too much, you get shit like Power of the Doctor, which I despised, which is so indulgent of the nostalgia and the returns and shit. But at the same time, you know, the reality is, like you said, Neo, that Tennant is super popular and is just... and also, at the same time, I think acknowledging that bringing back something super popular like Tennant might be a good thing is to acknowledge that the state the show was in immediately beforehand was not ideal. And some people maybe don't want to acknowledge that either.
Yeah. I think this is one of the things I'm maybe less tolerant towards than you are, Gig, and a lot of other fans, is... all this stuff, this grudge stuff, like, oh, it's understandable that, you know, we feel hard done by as Capaldi fans or Matt fans or McGann fans or whatever, you know, it's so hurtful to us to see all these people love David Tennant. Grow up. What have you got to complain about? You got 3 seasons of Capaldi. Oh, you know, a news article shaded Capaldi. Have you never been insulted before? You know, in public. He's a grown man. He did 3 seasons, 3 amazing. I just, this victim kind of mentality, I just don't understand it. You got 3 seasons of, what could there possibly be to complain about? No one's ever going to erase those seasons. We were spoiled. We got an extra season. We got the 2 that were meant to happen, and then we got a whole other bonus one, you know, at the end, and then we got a bonus episode on top of that, whatever we think of it. And even with McGann, I see the argument more, McGann and Colin, that, oh, they were underserved. They didn't get, you know, the runs that they should have gotten. And I agree with that more, but it was a very long time ago. And we can't say they both weren't spoilt for good stories afterwards in whatever formats, you know, even ones they got to perform as well on audio. I don't really see what there is to be upset about by these people who are beleaguered by Tennant's popularity. Yes, he's more popular than McGann and Capaldi. He always will be. It's never ever going to change. You have to make your peace with that unless you want to be salty about it forever. And why not join in the fun, you know? Open yourself up to Tennant a little. And if you don't like him, that's fine. But you've got reams and reams of Capaldi and reams of McGann. I don't understand the victimization some people feel. I don't get it. So when I see people get really shirty about the Tennant miniseries because they're thinking, oh, God damn it, Tennant's going to be in the limelight again. People are going to like Doctor Who again. You know, how dare? And people are going to be enjoying David Tennant on TV again. How my precious Capaldi, would be wounded by... No, he's not. Look how he talks about the show, to the press. He's perfectly happy having finished his time on. I think people, in my opinion, and I think I'm generally, very, very warm to lots of fandom impulses, even if they seem a bit silly. But this is the one that I kind of roll my eyes at. I think every Doctor has gotten served pretty well. They've all got a lot of stories. They've all got a great amount of material that we can engage with forever. I don't think Tennant getting more of the limelight is an injustice or anything to really aggravate. But a lot of people feel differently. But that's my take on it.
I think that victimization that you're talking about, that kind of is born from a sort of insecurity. Others don't like the thing that I like. Because, sort of stan culture, if you can call it that, does become this, is encouraged, to become this kind of all-encompassing part of one's identity. And so it feels like an attack on one's identity, on the part of, Jodie Whittaker fans, for example, the fans of the latest era, they sort of feel like somehow every time there's some new wonderful boom of popularity or success or whatever with the promo for the new stuff, this is a slight or an insult on the thing that they love because they see the kind of, how much it's trending or whatever. And I can guess that's where it's coming from, but it's odd.
When something's cut short, I get it. Like, if we cast our minds way back, do you remember all the furor over Firefly back in the day? When it, got cut short after its season, and there was understandable furor over that. People were really engaging with that show. It only got a season. I mean, it eventually got the movie, and I think that should, satisfied a lot of people. But I get it kind of then. Like, I think of shows I like if Hannibal had only gotten one season and then cancelled, I would still be salty. Sure, I would, because it could have done so much more, to quote Tennant, but it didn't get to. But actually, it did get to. Against all odds, it got 3 seasons, and I know they wanted to make more, but the 3rd season ended in a really good spot, and that's 3 seasons of TV. That is so much more, than so many shows or pilots get. And with Doctor Who, of all things, where the actors, if they want, can, perform forever on stories that, at least some of them will be really good, over at Big Finish. I don't get the victim thing, because I think every Doctor's been served well. And even the ones that weren't served well in their time, like McGann or arguably Colin, got a chance to afterwards. So I think any stan of any Doctor has more than enough stuff they can forever engage with happily, which is why I roll my eyes at the victim impulse here to think, it upsets me when people like the other one more than mine because mine didn't get enough. But I think all the Doctors have gotten enough. All the Doctors have gotten loads.
I don't think it's all that unusual to wish that other people would see the wonders and good things that you see in something. I think when you really love something, you wish others would appreciate it maybe more. But at the same time, it's a kind of a fool's hope at the end of the day, because you should like something because you like it. I don't think there's any point in just wishing everyone else would like it as well. No matter how great it might be and how kind of unjust it might be when someone just casually dismisses like everyone after Tennant or whatever. It doesn't really matter. Like that, it's just media. It's just content. It's entertainment. It should be entertaining you. You don't have to go to bat for it.
And you can get entertained by the silliness of people. Like, I know I laugh all the time at like the anti-Capaldi things. Like, you can do a drinking game when people say, I like the actor, but the writing was bad. Just because it's such a bizarre statement to make about that era of all. Like, it's funny to me. I get that it was a bit rougher in the era itself, but we're long past 2014 now.
So what you're saying is people should move on and not be so concerned with past glories, right? So
people should move on and accept that everyone got enough, I think, in terms of Doctors. So Tennant getting more than enough is, a bit crazy, but it's not like he's not robbing Jodie of a 4th season. He's not robbing McGann of a Time War spin-off. He's just, it is the future. He's not taking away anyone else's potential. It's not like they were going to go, Jodie's going to get a 4. Oh no, actually we'll bring Tennant back because Russell says he wants to do that. That's not what happened. It's not like they were going to go, Ncuti was right off the bat and Ncuti was going to, come and take over Jodie. Oh, but now David's coming back and he's taking over again. He's the future, and then Ncuti's the future after him. And then the future after Ncuti will be whoever it's going to be. Like, no one's getting robbed here.
And they've been very savvy about allowing Tennant and Gatwa to kind of be simultaneously the face of but equally the face of the future.
I love how they're doing it, yeah.
Rather than just, there's a Tennant miniseries and who knows what will happen after that. I think people would feel quite differently if that were the case.
Yeah, fairly, very fairly.
Yeah, exactly, fairly. But the fact that we know that there is something completely different to come, and there is a sort of brand new future, as it were, and a brand new Doctor who's not an old face, really changes things.
Ncuti going around doing interviews. Like when we talk about Disney in a second, Ncuti was one of the people that was going and giving the big, talk to everyone about the Disney deal. And Ncuti's got the videos on the YouTube channel, talking about Doctor Who, and Ncuti's saying the stories he wants to do. And Tennant's bigging up Ncuti in the magazine, and Ncuti's in the trailer for the Tennant miniseries. Like, they're trying to share the love here as much as they can. And, Tennant's going to have 3 hours, and then Ncuti is going to have, well, at the very least, 8 or 9 episodes, and obviously he's going to do more than that.
The thing is, right now, Gatwa is about to shoot a whole series. Like, pretty soon they'll reveal his companion, his costume, or whatever. That will be happening for, like, the whole ensuing year or whatever. Like, before 14 has even aired 1 episode. So the idea that the Tennant stuff is undermining Gatwa at this stage, the idea that taking Tennant's little quote about how this is the future and putting it on the cover of DWM next to a picture of Tennant is somehow undermining Gatwa and really bad optics about the Gatwa handover. It's implying that straight white men are the future, and it's being racist. I think it's just insane bad faith nonsense on the part of fans. It's just completely deranged. There's no relationship to reality at all.
I know there's a lot of opinions on the "this is the future" quote on the cover of the magazine. I really love it. I think it's so, what's the word, flagrant? It's so brazen. It's so bold to say that, because some people are going to take it as tongue in cheek and some people aren't. And I see arguments for both sides and I understand them both, but it's a big statement either way, isn't it? This isn't a reprise. This isn't a Big Finish box set with Ten and Donna again. This is what the show is next. This is what it's about to be. And Scott Hancock in the magazine says something. He's articulated something I've been arguing for a while now, where he says, we have a regeneration with a familiar face, and yet it's that familiarity which makes this process entirely different. We can't just overlook that. This is something that hasn't happened before. And this is what I keep arguing to people who say this is just, fan wank or bait for ratings and everything like that. Obviously casting Tennant as the Doctor again is doing something again, but again is the operative word there. Tennant was cast as the Doctor once or maybe a bit twice with Journey's End, but to bring back an actor as the Doctor, it's only been done in, little glimpses before, like Tom Baker in the 50th. To actually make this a big deal of, there's going to be hours of this actor being a new Doctor, it's unprecedented. And the fact it's unprecedented means it's novel, means it's new. And so I get that we're getting Donna back and Wilf back, and obviously there's going to be lots of reprisals of RTD1 era stuff. But this is fundamentally a new thing. Like Scott Hancock is saying that this hasn't happened before. This is why there's so much debate over it, because we don't know what's going to happen. This isn't something that's occurred before in the show. And for that reason, this is the future. That resonates with me, because this hasn't happened before. This is the future of the show. The show is doing something new by incorporating the past into it in this bizarre way. And I find that really exciting.
Even look at his costume, for example. The way that it is clearly influenced by his old outfit, but they've given it new twists on it, make it feel maybe even slightly more classic influence, in my opinion. They've got this square check pattern like Patrick Troughton.
Yeah.
I think that there's a vibe that being able to revise stuff and sort of give a new spin to stuff from the past, that is interesting, and that's something that's worth doing quite often. You don't have to, just because you did something once doesn't mean you have to leave it dead forever. You can never kind of rethink it or like try and do it again, see how you can make it different and make it more interesting. Like, there's always something you can do.
Yeah, and it's that same but different is the core there. I mean, some people were immediately speculating when the Tennant announcement happened back in May that these 3 specials would be a sort of, lost episodes from series 4 or whatever, that they were going to kind of, take place within the previous 10 and Donna stuff. And, if they had been doing that, then I think a lot of this kind of outrage would be quite justified, that would feel quite kind of backward looking. But as you say, because it's doing something that is a completely novel approach, it's going in a new direction that it raises a lot of questions. Kind of what is this going to mean? I love the new costume as well. I think it looks great.
Yeah, it's I like it better than its original costumes.
Yeah, I think it looks better.
He says in the magazine, Tennant says, if the costume were too different, I think that would feel wrong somehow. I couldn't be wearing a cape and space boots. The point of me doing it again means it has to feel kind of the same, a kiss to the past and a nod to the future. That last sentence I think is really interesting, the phrasing.
That's a nice phrase, that. Yeah.
A kiss to the past, I think maybe what we're going to get isn't so much like a self-reflective, oh, how dare we bring things back and we've got to apologize for our words and deeds with, I don't want to go and all that. Maybe instead of that, it's going to be more like a, the season of The Crown that came out this week has an episode where two people that were in love once, many, many decades ago reunite. And it's a very interesting kind of wistful encounter, when you encounter an old love and a bit of the past that can't really be incorporated into your life in the future, long term or anything. But there's this kind of flame when the past rubs up against itself again and the old feelings occur and, there's a bit of a twist on it and then you move on into the future. I feel like if there's a self-reflective element to it, rather than it being like a mournful, nostalgia bad thing, it might be more a kiss to the past, as Tennant is saying. Like, we're going to have a bunch of fun, a bunch of celebratory fun. We're doing all this, Tennant and Donna stuff again, and then we're going to send it off and march into the future afterwards. I think that feels a lot more likely to me.
We let it go, we get it out of our system, but in a healthy way, and
Yeah.
I think it's Matrix 4, isn't it? Because you mentioned Twin Peaks earlier on, but when you looked at Matrix 4, that's very much a kiss to the past movie, which is kind of anti the whole sort of corporate nostalgia, but also very much in love with the romance of the past and like what they had before. So I think it's just a very really wholesome take on it. It's a wholesome thing to do. It's a good idea.
I think people are, and I think part of it's because the Disney discourse influencing this too, since there's cooperation with Disney now, of course, and Disney. I'm not really a Star Wars guy, but Disney Star Wars, my understanding is that it's a lot of returning stuff from the past, maybe, and that's the full sentence, is there's the thing from the past is here again. Don't you guys love that? And I see there's a lot of comparisons, to bringing Tennant back to doing that. But I think none of those comparisons make sense because, like, when you bring back, it's that character from the old movie and they're here on the show again and then they're doing the thing they used to do again, they're fighting the same guy again or whatever, that's just reprising something. It's not doing what Scott Hancock, is calling the novel sort of familiarity, which is having a Doctor turn into David Tennant again isn't something that happened before. That's not just bringing back, hey, that character's from the cartoon and now he's here. The Meep stuff might be that, but Tennant being a new Doctor, Gig, do you get what I'm trying to say here? I don't think the Star Wars comparison holds.
Yeah, I think the nature of Doctor Who, when you have the character who is morphing and kind of recreating himself in all these different strange ways, it's so different from something like, I don't know, Star Wars or Marvel, which functions on cameos and filling in little gaps, I guess, or crossovers or whatever. Just having things that just show up by virtue of their familiarity. When you have the Doctor who is always being reborn in this way, there is always going to be an element of the unfamiliar and the strange and the new that takes any old thing you bring back in and gives it a new slant, a new spin somehow. I think it's just fundamentally really different. Also, bringing back Donna in whatever capacity they're going to be doing that, like, that's new too, I think, because we're seeing a part of her life that we haven't seen before. Like, when you look at Star Wars and how they're always trying to fill in the gaps between this set of movies and like kind of color in the outlines, when you do something like, okay, let's revisit this character whose story we thought was over, but we're going to come back to them at some later point and see what could be happening now, what could be so different. That's kind of new and interesting too.
The weird thing with Donna is that I feel the show has self-assessed Donna's ending before through, well, Moffat obviously regarded like wiping a companion's memory in a very different way, and the show dealt with that in a really interesting way in Series 9. And then Chibnall, he reassessed that again in Series 12. So it's like the show has worked through, the show has addressed Donna's ending again, kind of through suggestion, through other characters and stuff like that. So it's interesting to me to bring Donna back again. Like, I don't think it's as straightforward as being able to do like we're addressing the past and we're going to fix the past thing, because we've done that a bit already in the show. So I think it's going to be interesting because I feel like the show morally moved past Donna's ending and then it kind of flipped back. So I don't think it's as straightforward as like there's an unbroken line between Series 4 to these specials now, because the show has explored the mind wipe idea already. So whatever they do with Donna, I think will feel part of a larger conversation rather than just, we're undoing the thing, if that's what they do. I think, the Chibnall in many ways played around with the telos in the show in odd ways like that. I think also that's part of the reason that this Doctor being 14 doesn't bother me, because it bothers a lot of people. I don't know if, Einarr, you've seen, there's kind of truthers for that insist that Tennant isn't 14 and that Ncuti is 14. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
There's
Oh yeah.
it's whatever Russell says or whatever a press release says, whatever the magazine says, there are people who think it's all a trick or Russell's wrong or there's some strange business going on here and Ncuti is actually the true 14. And I think some of that comes out of I want the numbering to line up, logically with the eras of the show. Like I think
definitely.
we should have the first actor to play the role as the first Doctor and then it should all line up like this. And I totally get that impulse, and I used to feel that way. And, I had a big tantrum with the John Hurt stuff. Well, I didn't have a tantrum, but I was annoyed in 2013 with the John Hurt stuff, which kind of, as great as John Hurt is, I'm not complaining about that, but it screwed with the telos of the show, didn't it? Because in the real world, Sylvester was the Doctor, and then Paul McGann was the Doctor, and then Chris Eccleston was the Doctor. But now Moffat is saying, well, screw the real world connection with the show. Actually, John Hurt was the Doctor in between these two. I'm not judging Moffat because obviously so much went into why he did that and how it worked and everything. But the telos of the show, at least then, was kind of flipped around in a weird way. And I'd argue that the telos was mucked up again with Jo Martin's Doctor, as great as she is. It's no judgment on these Doctors themselves. It's just the way that the sequence of regenerations has been played with over time. And I think if we think about a sanctity of regenerations, like a lot of fans like to think of, and like I used to like the thought of, I think it's been getting...
It's gone.
Ship has sailed.
The threads have been getting pulled. I think there's a lot of different points you could say. You could go back to the wilderness years, but certainly in Ncuti, like there were 2 Tennant Doctors in Series 4, let alone now. And then, we started playing with duplicate Doctors all the time, the gangers, and then, in Series 6, Matt Smith, the fake-out regeneration. The Day of the Moon, when Little River was regenerating, that felt like a huge deal, didn't it? Because regeneration was such a special thing in the show. Now I'm sick of that damn regeneration noise. I've heard it in a bunch of audios. I've seen it in a bunch of episodes. It doesn't really feel as special to me as it did when, Chris Eccleston burst into orange back in 2005. I think that is what it is. I think it's kind of the nature of a sci-fi show in the 21st century is it's going to play around with its lore a lot.
I think a lot of fans still haven't cottoned on to how cheap incarnations of the Doctor are now, because fans are so used to the pomp and circumstance of a new number that giving it to an old actor for 3 episodes is frying their brains. They can't wrap their heads around it. But it really does not make a big... It's not a huge deal, but they just can't internalize that it's not a huge deal yet.
We had an episode about the Morbius Doctors not that long ago. I think the horse is truly bolted at this point.
And I also think, you're on hiding for nothing if you expect that after a year of, this sort of constant marketing blitz of, Tennant is 14 and Gatwa is 15, after kind of entrenching these ideas and numbers and this sequence in people's minds, for the program itself to then reverse this in some way, as you were saying, that some truthers are expecting, and he'll go, aha, actually Gatwa is number 14 and so on. It seems so implausible to me that they will go through the effort of sending one message and then undoing it with another. And
okay, well, I think some of the truthers and critics of RTD also kind of wished for this hypothetical handover from Whittaker to Gatwa, directly, and they're really chafing at the idea of Tennant being shoved in the middle, sort of the old kind of reprising an old glory thing, rather than going to the new thing. I think I see that a lot with the people who are mad at RTD. They felt that there should have been this glorious moment where Whittaker handed the reins, she said, "Hey, tag you're it, whoever I'm about to be next. It's time for the new era. Hey, here comes Gatwa." But instead they get Tennant, the reprise instead. And I think that's really pissing some people off. I think, again, it's kind of, I think there's still fans who are kind of really used to the old traditions that have been entrenched, new Doctor shows up in the old one's costume and such. And the fact when RTD does something, a curveball, like this reprise of Tennant, that's again, it's just kind of completely throwing them off and they don't know how to process it.
I've got complicated feelings over that. I'm sympathetic to fan brain stuff, like the fans thinking, Russell's just playing the long game again. He's going to reverse the numbering and all that. I'm sympathetic to that because I've been that fan a lot of the times where I get so caught up in the in-universe stuff that I forget that makes no fucking sense. Why would a producer try to confuse people and play around with semantics? Why? There'll be no possible... It could only harm the show to flip around numbers like that. It doesn't really matter. You don't do this wave of messaging and new branding just to undo it. That's some showrunners are into, let's do a thing just to undo it. But that's not what, Russell is about. He's trying to beam branding into people's minds. He's not going to undo it. So I'm sympathetic to why they think that way, because I've definitely gotten caught up in the in-universe stuff before and forgotten, how things will really function in the real world. But yeah, but on the expectation that Jodie would turn into Ncuti and genuinely expecting that, I've seen so many people go, they lied to us, and they said they were going to do this. I'm still working through my feelings there, because, well, in the magazine, in this magazine, it says that who knows what we'll get away with and what people are expecting, David Tennant says. But there will be at least some doubt. He's talking about who they think Jodie will regenerate into when they're watching the centenary. I hope, as to quite who Jodie Whittaker is going to turn into, I hope there'll be some doubt. With a fair wind, we might even have most people expecting Ncuti to pop up, and then it's my stupid face. Most media outlets are calling Ncuti the 14th. Good, says David, smiling. I don't know if such coups can be pulled off in the modern world, but that's what we're aiming for. Let's see. So they were wanting, at least David Tennant, and I assume Russell as well, were wanting confusion here. They were wanting this to be a big deal, and a big shock, and everyone's going to be talking about it. Of course they want that. They want everyone talking about the show again. They want to do a big stunt, a big showman thing. That's what this team is like. They know how to run a show and get it popular. So they wanted people to be tricked a bit there. But I think this is where maybe I'm getting up myself and I'm bringing in too much real world stuff. But you were never lied to, ever, about what was going to happen. You never were ever lied to about this. All the communications from the people who matter never lied. And like I said, and like we've all been extremely vindicated on, it mattered, the wording that was in those things. I'm from a public relations background, and I can say it really mattered, the words they were using and the words they weren't using. These press releases from big, very experienced producers aren't just tossed out arbitrarily. They really go over the wording of these things. None of us were ever lied to, and it's not like it's ridiculous to say it's anyone's duty to be suspicious or to read between the lines of a Doctor Who casting article. That's ridiculous, and that's treating something with so much more pomposity and seriousness with it deserves. But by the same token, then acting like you were betrayed is doing the same thing, isn't it? It's putting so much more seriousness onto a casting than it deserves. But the big thing here, to me, is that there were news articles calling him the 14th Doctor, calling Ncuti the 14th Doctor, and including even BBC ones. And so I get why people they feel hoodwinked or betrayed now. But I think, and this is where I might be getting up myself, but I think this is kind of I think it's a teachable moment, about sourcing to people, and that if you just take in headlines and news articles as kind of all similar to each other, or this kind of same noise of news you absorb from the world, yes, you are going to get lied to, and you are going to get stuff wrong, and you are going to get tricked all the time if you're just taking in this ether of news around you. That's a choice you can make, and you're going to get stuff wrong all the time if you do that. If you're more mindful of, well, who would actually know anything about this topic? Who would know about what's going on in Doctor Who? Well, I guess the people who make the show would know. Who makes the show? Let me look that up. Oh, it's Bad Wolf. Oh, so this press release from Bad Wolf isn't saying the 14th Doctor. That's interesting. All these other sites from places that don't make the show, like Screen Rant or even BBC News, well, it doesn't matter so much what they say, does it? Because they wouldn't know. You can extrapolate that out to any real-world issue ever in the world and say, who would actually know something about this? Are they the ones reporting it? Who would have something to gain from reporting something one way? It's very basic, media literacy. But this is why, like, I feel that if you feel betrayed, I totally understand why you would, and I don't think there's any expectation for you to be treating Doctor Who news with more seriousness than it deserves. But you very much weren't betrayed, and if this is bothering you a lot, I think it's a bit of a lesson in how sourcing works.
But also, I think people got their hopes up. I think when you announced that the next Doctor's going to be a black dude, and it's like people want to see that. People want to see that happen. So when they're getting their hopes up, regardless of whether or not they've close read the press release or whatever, if people are going to get their hopes up after that announcement, and you say, "Psych, wait another year, bye, you can't see him yet, go away, Tennant first." I think the maybe slightly wounded hopes resulting from that, I think are understandable, because people want to see the show evolve and do some other things and stuff, and people want to see a black man as the Doctor. Like, it's completely understandable. But again, I think the rage towards RTD is a bit ridiculous because it's locked in. Gaptor is coming. We're about to see him shoot his first series. It's happening.
I understand the rage as well because Tennant is saying there we wanted to trick you. He's smiling, saying it's good that they're calling Ncuti the 14th. Like, they were egging this on by how they did it. And I can say, oh, well, you should have known because, think about, who was saying what. But look, they were wanting people to get upset, I think, is, how else can you read that? If you wanted people to get tricked, of course, some people are going to get upset. So I totally get getting angry over in that sense. But on the other sense, this is the future is Tennant, and this is the future of the future is Ncuti. It's like we said before, it's not like Ncuti's getting robbed of anything. We're going to have loads of years of Ncuti. But at the same time, of course, it makes sense if you were really expecting a black man to pop up as the Doctor in November 2023. Yeah, you having to wait a bit longer does suck, especially if you were really, if you'd connected a lot with that so quickly.
Yeah, I think it's patience, really, isn't it? And patience it's annoying. It's a pain to just say, hey, just wait a bit longer. Yeah. But at the end of the day, it's a TV show. It is what it is.
And also, he is going to be in the 60th specials anyway. As we've seen. So,
That's true. He was even in the trailer.
Yeah, he was in the trailer, right. So we've already had footage of him in the part.
I saw this reaction video where loads of people were like really just nonplussed by Tennant, but when Ncuti popped up in the trailer, they were like, ah! Just the huge... So I think like showing him in that trailer was very savvy, because people wanted to see him in some capacity. Yes.
And, who knows, maybe, he had time to film more substantial stuff for that than people expect. Who knows? I mean, maybe that's getting hopes up again, but... yeah, we just don't know at this point.
I know this feels somewhat ridiculous, but a lot of this is just a function of we know about the miniseries, but we don't really know much at all about Series 14, other than it sounds like it's going to have a Roswell episode, maybe the finale, based on what Russell was hinting at in the production notes. And if I read the production notes right, it sounds like Series 14 will be 8 episodes, but there's also going to be a Christmas special before it. That's a Ncuti episode. Did I understand that correctly?
Yeah, I believe so, yeah.
That's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of Doctor Who. That's great to hear. Well, there are 3 other things I still want to talk about, which are just the Costumegate, Disneygate, and well, this kind of ties into the truth and lies thing, actually. So I'll bring this up now. Russell himself, in these production notes, the ones that hint at Roswell being part of Series 14, maybe the finale, and that say there's going to be 8 episodes and then actually a Christmas special with Ncuti beforehand. So 4 specials. Wow, that's a lot for 2023. That's exciting. They're all packed in at the end too. It's not like Tennant's first specials year where they were kind of spread out a bit more.
Yeah, it's a big glut.
That's going to be a really exciting end of the year. Yeah. But in these production notes, Russell says, it's funny how only a year into pre-production, the principal players have all got slightly different memories of how this happened. I've learned over the years that when the official history of Doctor Who says that in 1973, Barry Letts said X, Y, and Z, there was probably no such thing. That event was just chiseled into anecdote 25 years later. Reader, is anything ever true? So he's getting very existential there already. And that's such an interesting point about, how things solidify, that never even happened just because they make for better stories or people misremember or whatever. And to that end, he talks about what we've talked about, that the tweet-alongs during the UK lockdowns were what kind of fermented up this idea of Russell, David, and Donna, and Tate getting back together, because they'd done a Runaway Bride tweet-along. It's not the only one they did either. That Gig mentioned the Fires of Pompeii one. Catherine texted Russell to say how much she'd enjoyed doing that tweet-along together. Russell texted back, God, let's get David to do some more Doctor and Donna. I loved it so much. And then Russell says in the magazine column here, he thought Catherine said it first, but it was him. He didn't think he really meant the whole plan of coming back together, though. He says there was no secret plan at work, but Catherine replied, let's do it. The Doctor and Donna, the Lost Adventures. And then Russell says he thought that wouldn't really happen, and Jodie was, on screen, and Chibnall was running the show. But then Catherine Tate texted Russell again on 23 of December. David said he'd do it again in a heartbeat. Who do we need to speak to? Come on, let's get the old band back together. So Russell double-checked with David Tennant, and Tennant said, yes, of course he did. Tennant's still doing bloody, Nissa audios, and, he loves the job. He's kept up with the job in a way the other New Who actors haven't. He really, really loves the job, obviously. Russell says he had to be professional as a former producer of Doctor Who. If David and Catherine said they wanted to do more Doctor Who, it was literally his job to let the BBC know. It wasn't his choice anymore. It was his duty. And here's where I start. Yeah, I look on what Russell says here with raised eyebrows, maybe very slightly. He says, I knew the 60th was coming up 3 years ahead. I kind of knew vaguely that Chris was only doing 3 years as showrunner. He talks about how he's friends with Chris. Russell says, I thought I'll just throw it out there. And since Chris Chibnall is doing the busiest job in TV, I won't add this idea to his workload. I'll email Piers Wenger, the director of drama, simply reporting in to ask, I have no idea about your future plans, but might this fit in somewhere? A special, the anniversary, an extra, a one-off, maybe? What do you think? An answer came back just saying, oh, that's interesting, thank you. Let me get back to you. And Russell says months passed without anything happening, but that's pretty normal for TV production. And, there was lockdown going on and all that stuff. And then, he was doing It's a Sin, so lots of stuff was happening, blah, blah, blah. And then he says, to be continued. The next production notes, we'll get into this more. I mean, he literally opens this by saying, don't always believe the histories that, the producers and the writers tell you because, anecdotes get more popular than the actual truth. And I'm misremembering stuff about who texted who first and everything here. I don't want to be, I don't want to contradict myself when I was speaking so much of like strictness to sources and whatnot. But I think if we're generally thinking about media literacy and reading in between the lines and looking at who's saying what and the motivations of who is saying what, am I paranoid to look very slightly askance at the narrative he's suggesting here, that it was all just kind of fun and games and, fluffy kind of, oh, I knew the 60th was coming up very vaguely and I just thought I'd send out an idea and it all just worked out brilliantly. What do you guys think of that?
Well, maybe we'll see more of it in the ensuing installments of this tale. But certainly, when you look at how just like efficient this whole takeover with Bad Wolf has been, and just how just how solid it is, and just how focused on getting everything together again, and how it's evolved from not just being 60th specials, but to a full-on takeover of the show, a Disney deal, everything like that, the complete franchise reinvention. It does seem a bit like, well, can it really just have been a whim? Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe it started as one, but certainly it has not ended as one. That much is obvious.
Yeah, I can buy the kind of, let's maybe do this as a one-off. It'll be a bit of fun, a sort of, a reunion party almost. I can buy that being, a sort of whimsical idea. And I love that it came from Catherine Tate as well, because, of the three of them, she is the one who by far the least sort of lives and breathes Doctor Who. I mean, healthily so, good for her, but I kind of find it hilarious that she's the one who was like, oh, let's do it. And the other two sort of nonplussed, kind of, oh, okay. I think the way that it's developed and grown into something much, much bigger and much more of a franchise kind of thing. He's the new showrunner now, as opposed to just sort of coming back for a one-off. And God knows how many years the sort of RTD2 will last. Yeah, that feels a little bit more like there's more to be told.
A few months ago, Tennant was telling the BBC it all happened a little bit by accident. He was trying to say it was just all kind of arbitrary. It's just a bit of playful fun coming off the lockdowns, and who knew it would turn out this way. And I think it's a really endearing narrative, this idea that I just bubbled up, what fun. But there's, like Gig said, there's such an efficiency here that I'm a little dubious of this idea that, it just, the chips just rolled as they may, here, what a bit of fun it was that this happened to, like, huge moves have been made here. The Disney deal, and, Bad Wolf taking over, like, it's not BBC Studios anymore. It's a whole different company creates the show now. Like,
I was going to say, especially since we know that, Chibnall had been saying, he was struggling to find someone to pass the baton to, I think was the phrasing. This was not a show that had a very clear existing future and succession plan that the RTD return has kind of stomped on.
When RTD mentioned that he went to the BBC, that kind of surprised me a little bit. I'd always assumed that the BBC must have reached out to him, like, oh, we'll get anyone, let's get him back, he was good. But I suppose, thinking about it, if the BBC had given that much of a shit, maybe the last 4 years might have been a very different story. So maybe it is more realistic that RTD went to them first.
Certainly with the desire for a one-off, I can believe that he Yeah, I doubt that when he approached them, he was thinking ahead, with this. Right, and then I'll cast Ncuti Gatwa, and we'll do several seasons, and, that doesn't ring true.
This is probably a good spot to start bringing in the Disney of it all, because we're talking about how it's all getting sold as a very fortuitous, little happy accident. And even if it was, it certainly evolved into something much, much larger and much more coordinated. Like we're saying, the execs, Chibnall and Stevens, they might not have someone to hand off the show to. They don't know what was going to happen with the show. And suddenly the show, obviously the BBC, it's the BBC show forever. They own the show. But, BBC Studios was making the show. That's, this separation there. And now Bad Wolf's making the show instead. I think from the outset here, most people don't know what a production company is. And most people don't know how TV is made. That's completely normal. I don't know how lots of stuff is made. I don't know how all sorts of things are made in the modern world. It's not weird to not know the particulars of how TV is made. It's not a wrong thing, but that's the nature of it, that people don't know how this all works. I see people all the time say, oh, Netflix made this show, and no, they didn't. Someone different made it. Netflix may have distributed it. Maybe it's an original, or maybe they're just licensing it. People don't know. Or people say, oh, Amazon made so-and-so show. No, they didn't. Sony did, and Amazon's just distributing it. So there's all those particulars of how things work, which is no expectation for people to know. Why would you know? I don't know how lots of stuff works, but it is what it is. So Disney, I think to preface the Disney thing, I think there's a really important bit of context that I've seen some confusion over, and that is the Telegraph. How would you Brits describe the Telegraph?
Sort of paper for words that I should not use. Basically, that's as far as I'm going with that.
A conservative, right-wing leaning, supposed respectable type broadsheet, but yeah, supposed.
So before any Disney stuff was happening, very, 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 very close before, like late October, the Telegraph ran a very incorrect article, which was saying that the headline was the headline was, "Is it time for the BBC to bin Doctor Who?" So obviously this is a headline trying to grab your attention and make you emotional and all that sort of thing. And within this ridiculous article, the Telegraph listed some figures which are, wrong to a comedic degree. And I saw loads of people taking this article seriously because, again, like I keep saying about sourcing, people just treat news as kind of this equal ether. Like that people know, oh, so-and-so is very, very right-wing and I'm not going to pay attention to that one. Or so-and-so is some crazy, whatever news from whatever country. But generally they seem to treat a lot of news as sort of an ether that they just kind of agree to. Or they'll, news will re-report things from other sources and they'll say, well, they might not, they might think, oh, if Fox News says something, I won't believe it. But if someone else republishes it and I don't see it's from Fox News, maybe I will believe it if the headline's a bit different. So out of the ether, whether people, disrespect the Telegraph or not, they might have seen some version of this. So before the Disney thing, they had this article saying, Doctor Who made 1.8 billion in global sales last year, 550 million of which were from the US. So it's one of the BBC's biggest exports and it's worth 3 times as much as the UK fishing industry. That's wrong. That's not true. Those are all incorrect figures and they're decade-old figures as well. Those are reused statistics that have been misinterpreted and extrapolated. It's all wrong, basically. That's not true. They've reprinted stats from 2013 and they've misunderstood what they meant and it's wrong, basically. So the Telegraph reports a bunch of wrong stats about Doctor Who. And I saw some Twitter exchanges where, nice people, well-meaning people were confused by people getting annoyed and saying this is bullshit because I was like, but it's in the article. It says in the article. And this is my, bugbear again. Just because it's in an article doesn't mean it's true.
A UK newspaper lying? Unheard of.
Yeah, so that's the kind of preface to the Disney thing. So very, very shortly after that, the Telegraph publishes another article, which everyone leaps to believe again because I don't fucking know at this point. But they published an article saying Doctor Who to get American makeover as Disney takes on British classic. And so, this is real. Obviously, this is real that the BBC and Bad Wolf are working with Disney because they have their own press release about this. And, Ncuti himself he spoke at a lunch hosted by the BBC and Disney recently, and he was saying to them that Doctor Who's roots are so deep in British culture and the fabric of Britishness that as a Ronduan immigrant to the country, it feels just really powerful. And Ncuti said that the Doctor role is significant for people of colour, for marginalised people who really gravitate towards the show because it's about friendship and it's about adventure and it's about union and unity. And also Doctor Who is able to turn into anything or anyone, so the possibilities are endless. So that's Ncuti speaking in, that speak that companies love, where he's bringing people together and this is important, and this is powerful, and this is all great. And he's speaking to how it emotionally connects with him. Awesome brand unity. BBC and Disney connect with this brand unity. We've shared values. This kind of what he's talking about there, this kind of representational stuff. That's great. In the press release from the BBC end, Disney Plus is to become the new global home for upcoming seasons of Doctor Who outside of the UK and Ireland. And it's talking about how, Disney and BBC are two giants of entertainment, two huge brands, and they're coming together, and Doctor Who's a global franchise. Remember, press releases are always worded so carefully. And in this one, it says, under a shared creative vision, they will deliver this quintessentially British show to future generations on an unprecedented scale, with Disney Plus as the exclusive home for new seasons of Doctor Who outside the UK and Ireland. So it's the press release is talking about a distribution deal. So like in my country, Australia, where Doctor Who's been free on our Australian ABC channel, which is like the BBC over here, it's been free forever. I first saw Doctor Who as like a 4 or 5 year old on the ABC, greatest show in the galaxy. And, I watched New Who on the ABC for free with my family when I was younger and everything. That's gone now. Now I need to pay for an overpriced, ever-increasing prices for Disney Plus, a streaming service to watch Doctor Who legally now, unless I bought the Blu-rays, which I do anyway, so whatever. But yeah, I don't know, other countries are going to be suffering that now. So that is what it is. Anyway, back to the press release. It's talking about Russell's bold vision, and it's got all this talk, that links the shared values of Disney and the BBC. And it's talking about the show will be produced in Wales by Bad Wolf with BBC Studios Productions. That's pretty important, isn't it? Saying who makes the show. You'd expect an article about, things to do with production and distribution to mention who makes the show they're talking about. So of course the press release talks about Bad Wolf, who are the people who make the show now. And then there's lots of speak from Russell and from people on Disney's end about shared values, all that. The press release is about a distribution deal. The one thing that does confuse me with it though, because it talks about exclusively, to all these other countries, so it's outside of the UK and Ireland, it's all going to be Disney Plus. I don't know about every country, but China has a pre-existing deal through to Series 15 with SMG, Shanghai Media Group. So, and Disney Plus isn't in China. So I don't know if they're not getting into the nitty-gritty semantics of everything there. But that confused me because I remember that was a big deal back when the BBC made that deal through to Series 15 back in the day. Anyway, that's all the stuff that really happened in the press release. What do you guys think when you first heard all that?
Well, I think stuff like shared creative vision is kind of vague, sort of corporate speak. I think it's hard to draw any concrete conclusions there about how much influence like one side or another is going to have. I mean, it's just like, obviously, it's just a shame to be pay-gating the show across the globe. So, I think a international piracy federation for Doctor Who might be something to look into. But other than that, I think, yeah, just sort of nonplussed about it, really. I think it's hard to, if you're in the UK and Ireland and it's not going to affect you, it's hard to really feel like a concrete sense of the shift there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it, as you say, it's not going to affect me personally, but the sense that Doctor Who will now be on a platform that is, yes, okay, paid for, but is hugely popular and widespread, and it's the thing that kids and families are using. It in terms of the broad reach that the program is going to have, it's quite hard to argue that it's going to be a negative in terms of the amount of people it's going to reach now.
Oh, it's as a business deal, it's canny beyond belief. Yeah.
Yeah. It's going to be massive. So, yeah, that's good. I think I can understand the trepidation that people feel when they see the name of the House of Mouse popping up and kind of, especially words like American makeover. I know that gets into the Telegraph article, but phrases like American makeover and the idea that kind of, it's going to be... People will instantly think of American reboots of British programs that, have sunk like lead balloons and yeah. So I can understand why people immediately sort of leapt to a lot of caution and kind of unease about it.
Also, just like the general consolidation approach of Disney swallowing up everything like the absorber off. I think people have that paranoia about Doctor Who being sort of glommed into that mass of just cultural consolidation and just eating everything.
And then Disney producing about a gazillion Who spin-offs and yeah.
Which is where the Star Wars fears come from, of course, as we mentioned earlier.
I think the press release, interesting as it was, didn't flare people as much as the Telegraph article, because the Telegraph article has a bit that the press release doesn't. The ever-reliable Telegraph says, and I'm not finishing the conversation here because there's something in the magazine which complicates this, but the Telegraph article says, it is understood that Disney will have a creative input in the series. And that's what fired people up. Disney controlling Doctor Who, that's very understandable for people to not like that.
Nightmare scenario.
Yeah, it's absolutely understandable. I mean, it's from Telegraph, who, literally days before did like a hilarious fuck up of the numbers in another article about Doctor Who. But the biggest fuck up in this article to me is, so it's an article that's purporting to be about, the production of the show and the distribution of the show and how the show is made and everything. It not once mentions who makes the show. Bad Wolf isn't in this article. So the Telegraph fucked up an article hugely a couple of days before this one. And then in an article which everyone is taken so seriously about how the show's getting made and who is input into the show now, it doesn't mention the makers of the show. So I was skeptical reading this Telegraph article and then seeing, people just glom more stuff together. Disney is Disney. And so Disney, they do all this stuff with Star Wars I hate. So now they're going to do it to Doctor Who, and Disney are going to... Blah, blah. Initially, I was rolling my eyes at all that because I was thinking, well, officially this is getting sold to us as a distribution deal. And of course, that comes with money. Just like the SMG deal with China came with money. Loads of money. Of course it did. So of course money is pouring in from Disney here. But it's different to money through a distribution deal compared to like what's the Telegraph suggesting? Like a co-production, like some kind of shared creative, production of the show.
Yeah,
that's a different thing. What the Telegraph's suggesting, and so for the last, weeks or days, I've been kind of amping people down a bit, saying, well, the Telegraph isn't very reliable, and look at the actual press release. This just looks like a distribution deal to me. I didn't see everyone go crazy about. Well, I saw one person go crazy about the SMG deal on Reddit back in the day. But I've never seen anyone else go that crazy about it. That's a huge, that's an enormous distribution deal. It's through to Series 15, and that was done ages and ages ago. Never see people get that worked up with the HBO deals, the HBO Max deal, or, BBC America, or other networks the show's been on before.
It's because Disney is like a metonym for capitalist evil and greed, isn't it? I think that's the thing.
Yeah. So I was thinking, the stuff I dislike about the Disney deal, like I hate that the show's getting pay-gated now, and there's, even the big budget, like, it's a good thing, obviously at its core, but it makes me a little bit scared. Like, what's happening to my little show? What's going to change? But the creative control thing, I thought, that's bunk. That's from the Telegraph. But then I read the new Doctor Who magazine, and in Scott Hancock's production notes segment, there's a bit of it where he's saying Thursday, 15th of September, edits of the 3 2023 Doctor Who specials are sent to the BBC and Disney Plus for notes. And here my knowledge starts to fail me a little bit. I don't know if that's normal for distribution deals. I don't know. So is that normal? And, I should keep being totally skeptical of this idea they have untold creative input? Or is this actually happening a little bit? That there is some kind of creative input into the show? I know for sure to not trust the Telegraph, but that doesn't necessarily mean what they suggest is wrong. It just means, not to trust it because it comes from them. So I don't know. How do you guys read this thing? Hancock saying the episodes get sent to Disney Plus for notes.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, I don't know enough either about the ins and outs and the nitty-gritty of this sort of distribution or co-production deal to know how normal that is or isn't. I mean, certainly, something like the projects that Moffat has had with the kind of BBC and Netflix, for example, over the last kind of couple of years, yeah, totally normal for those to get feedback from both sides. Here, yeah, it gave me pause as well. I'll say. So I wasn't entirely sure how to take it.
Well, I think it sort of makes sense that Disney Plus are going to want to see what they'll be putting on their service, but I think it's just unless we know like what the nature of those notes are, how wide-ranging they might be, and we just can't really draw that many conclusions. At the same time, I think Doctor Who it's a safe as fuck show. I don't think it's going to get like some huge censorship deal from Disney. I don't think Disney's going to like force RTD to stop including gay and trans people in it. I mean, it's just absurd, you know. I mean, if anything, I have to assume part of Disney's confidence in taking on the show at this juncture is that RTD made it really popular in the past, and now he's in charge again. Like, why on earth would they be like, okay, RTD, you can't be RTD, stop? Oh yeah, and that would also assume that executives are sensible and know what they're doing, which often is not the case. So, you know, who can say?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the sort of fears that people immediately started saying was, oh, what if it kind of, yes, queer content gets censored and so on. It's like, well, there's a very prominent trans actor playing trans character in the first 3 2023 specials. It's like, you know, this is probably going to be the queerest thing on Disney Plus. You know, yeah. It didn't sound like it's the sort of thing where they're going to be steamrollering over what Russell can do. But yeah, who knows?
Yeah, I think this is coloured by the fact that there are lots of shows right now that could not exist without the money that big streaming organisations are providing them. But certainly with the budgets it's been operating on previously, that's not the case for Doctor Who. This Disney deal seems like a canny move and a move to make the show bigger and more widely seen. That's what all this budget discourse essentially is about at the end of the day. It's making the show bigger. It's people's fears and hopes for what could a bigger budget mean, and the show being seen by more people. Bigger. What's that about? So the Disney deal doesn't seem like a matter of how just to keep the show existing in the first place. That's perhaps what the Bad Wolf deal with RTD was, but that's a production deal. That's about who's making the show. And this Disney deal is a distribution deal about how is the show getting seen in countries that aren't the UK or Ireland. But when it comes to Scott Hancock talking about sending episodes over for notes, like Gig says, that's understandable in the context of let's call them a values-sensitive network like Disney, wanting to know what's going on in their service. They're not so much a free-for-all like Netflix or Amazon. But reading Hancock's own words there, I start hesitating a little bit, because that's actual sourcing, you know, that's not somewhere unreliable or someone just making probably reasonable estimation. That's Scott Hancock. That's someone actually making the show right now. And sending episodes off to a distributor for notes could be a small thing or a large thing. We don't really know. It's such a small sentence here. It's all kind of opaque, because the only real thing the Disney deal press release confirmed was that it's a big distribution deal. It doesn't talk about co-production. It just talks quite warmly about brand alignment and quite tangibly about distribution. So that's plenty of money and everything, but it's certainly not framing Disney as an active producer, an active maker of the show or anything. All that said, the optics of sending episodes off for Disney Plus's notes, those optics are what they are. We would have a clearer picture of what that means if we had a clearer picture of the relationship BBC Studios and previously the mainline BBC had with past distributors like HBO Max. But the Chibnall era of Doctor Who magazine was not super forthcoming with detail. All I know right now is that, and what we know firmly, is that there's a distribution deal with Disney, and I also know firmly that I keep seeing a very constant stream of effectively sourceless articles and headlines predating this Hancock note in Doctor Who magazine 584, for what that's worth. Articles and headlines fear-mongering about Disney's vast, engulfing creative control of the show now. And of course, this sort of stuff gets people clicking on all sorts of things, doesn't it? It gets a lot of engagement because people get scared and people get angry, all that jazz. And so I'm very leery of how attractive the Disney fear-mongering narrative is to people and to websites wanting clicks. People love this fear narrative, I think. I think it inspires a lot of rage. It gets people worked up. So it inspires engagement in that way. But it also, it's one of those things, the world seems more understandable and simple with these sort of narratives, even if they're a bit dodgy to actually just apply blankly to everything. Like, this sort of narrative lets people connect up other things, like issues they have with other franchises that are completely unrelated, or issues they have with modern media or society in general. It lets them all connect that up in ways that make the modern world and modern media make sense, and it all links together so smoothly in their mind. And I'm inherently super skeptical and leery of those sort of narratives that just make sense and link up unrelated things to people together. I'm leery of dipping too quickly and too easily into those easy, would-be intuitive sort of narratives, particularly when so much of the kindling for them is from articles that cannot even keep straight who is or isn't making the show in the first place. Is it possible that Disney is injecting more money into the show than one might expect of a distribution deal, even one of this enormous scale? And is it possible that money comes with some form of strings, in the sense of some form of creative seat at the table? Yes, of course it is. Of course it is. But if we eventually are to know that specifically, we don't really know that yet. And the scale and scope of the distribution deal is so huge that there aren't really any useful precedents to compare it to. One thing's for certain, and it's that I'm not untrustworthy of RTD and the rest of his Bad Wolf team here, who bought the show back in 2005. I'm not untrustworthy of them when it comes to knowing the right decisions to make when it comes to running the show. That's not blind faith in their authority, but it's faith that they're not getting duped, especially because it's not like the show couldn't exist without Disney. If people are interested in seeing the interactions with production companies and distributors and how murky and messy everything can get there, there's a really good GQ article from October 2021 about the Wheel of Time show. The showrunner of that show, Rafe Judkins. This article is totally worth a read, even if you have no interest in fantasy television or that show or anything, just because of the nitty-gritty of making TV that the article gets into. That show is perceived by nearly everyone as being made by Amazon. It's made by Sony, for what it's worth, but Amazon's role in it does go beyond just distribution, whatever that means, and it does involve an enormous amount of money. So there's a ghastly bit of that GQ article that goes, it's 2 paragraphs, I'll read it out. It goes, "But the first episode of a series also has to satisfy everyone involved in releasing it, including the executives overseeing the production. Amazon had taken the unusual step of renewing the show for a second season before the first season had aired, and so Judkins and his cast and crew were currently in the midst of shooting that second season, meaning the production had now been shooting 2-hour-long episodes at a time for nearly 2 years straight, interrupted only by the occasional global lockdown, piloting a giant ship into increasingly unknown waters. We're getting into more of a rhythm of how you make a huge feature film every 2 months, Judkins said. But that also meant that even as Judkins had spent the summer filming the second season in remote and inconvenient places, he was getting notes from Amazon, often via satellite phone, asking for post-production changes to the first season. I say sometimes that show running is basically just laying your body over the show and trying to protect it as you take 10,000 swords into your back," Judkins told me wearily one day over the phone. He said he'd had his assistant keep track of how many suggestions Amazon had just for the pilot. "In the end, we got 11,000 notes," Judkins said. "Actual number. Even if I only do like a tenth of those, that's still like multiple notes per second," he said. Executives had questions about individual shots and how the show was depicting magic. They had questions about style and tone. And they were friendly questions, but they were also infinite. And every time Judkins got one, usually while he was on some faraway set full of new and different problems to solve, he had to consider whether it was worth doing or whether to dig in. "It's very hard to take your little precious kernel of an idea and deliver it at the end of the production and notes process," he said. So if you want fear-mongering about money with strings attached, a direct interview with an actual showrunner like that is a great source. And all these vagaries about facts about the Doctor Who Disney deal that we don't actually know about really aren't so great. But you can see where the general air of dread around big budget genre shows and huge distribution deals arises from. But these fears over Disney owning the show or creating the show, to my mind, that's where it's going beyond reason.
Yeah.
Mm.
At the end of the day, it's the BBC's show, which I don't think everyone gets. But the BBC don't make it per se, and not in every country do they distribute it. But it's the BBC's show. They own it, and I dare say they're going to own it forever. It's the BBC's show. That's not changing. The show is made by Bad Wolf, who Doctor Who's in their blood, obviously, because it's the people who bought Doctor Who back in 2005 with RTD. RTD's not Bad Wolf per se, but he's making the show with Bad Wolf. So it's getting made through very trusted hands, almost too trusted hands, as we were suggesting earlier. Disney at least are distributing it in countries that aren't the UK or Ireland or China, I guess. I'm not quite sure what's happening there. Whether there's more to it than that, I think we'll find out one way or the other eventually. But the alarmist kind of, Disney owns the show now, and Disney are going to do this and Disney are going to do that. It's needless panic, I think. It doesn't really line up with anything. I
think to a certain extent the neoliberal dystopian future of Doctor Who that people are fearing it's already happened. Like, we've been in there for like ages, I mean, the handover to BBC Studios itself, a company, was in a sense part of that process. So it's like we're kind of already in that zone. I don't think there's much worse it can really get realistically within the current foreseeable parameters.
I think one thing I can understand a degree of caution about is what would happen, and this is probably a while off, but what would happen when Russell decides to take a back step and stop running the show, at least kind of in the day-to-day. He might stay an exec, perhaps, quite likely, but when somebody else is the head writer and it's he's less involved as the person kind of standing up to Disney in a bit of a David and Goliath kind of situation. So I can see why people maybe are a bit kind of cautious about, what would happen then? Would they muscle in? But as you say, it is still the BBC's show. They have the rights. I mean, quite what situation the BBC will be in 4, 5, 6 years, and how desperate they will be to flog things off, I don't know. But you have to imagine that someone as canny and as invested in securing the show's long-term future as RTD would think about this. He would know to train up a successor and somebody who kind of, is on the same page as everyone at Bad Wolf and everyone at BBC and, makes Disney happy as well. He would know to do this. I don't believe that he would get kind of caught out about this, personally, but I think there's no way they're going to let the show slip into potential nothingness like it nearly did with Chibnall and Stevens. I'm not insulting the era. I'm saying it nearly stopped getting made after them, like they've said. So legacy plans, I'm sure everyone's thinking a lot about that. And, Russell knows infinitely more than we can or ever about, how to do any of this. So he knows what he's doing. And it's not his first rodeo dealing with, American distributors before. He did Torchwood 4 in America back in the day, working with Stars. He knows what he's doing. But to me, it's just scary that the show is, in a way, it was kind of safer to think, what if the show gets off the air and we're in that second wilderness years like we were talking about. Not saying it's a good thing necessarily, but that feels like a safe option because it's something we understand. Is the show kind of wasting away and then living on in, these small, not popular forms. But the show getting more popular and more accessible, it's obviously, I'm actually a little bit hesitant to inherently say it's a great thing. I'm inclined to think that right now, but I don't want us to always treat that as a given. It's not necessarily always a great thing just for something to be popular. Sort of like the idea that growth is always good. And it's like, well, cancers grow. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. So I don't want to, forever suggest that Doctor Who getting made. Well, actually, there's a very good example of, I think there's a certain arena in which Doctor Who is getting made for its own sake a lot of the time, too much. And I don't think it's a good thing. But
we love stories.
Yeah.
How can you think that we don't?
Yeah. Content generation for its own sake or for just the monetary sake isn't always a good thing, with Doctor Who. But in general, I think the show continuing to exist is a good thing. I think most fans can agree on that, and I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm just saying it's a little bit scary that the show is getting a lot more money pumped into it from what it sounds like, and it's going to, be seen on a paid service in so many countries now, and it's the Chibnall years were safe and comfortable in the kind of mistakes they were making, or the connections they were making or not making was safe and comfortable and understandable in terms of the history of the show. This big Disney deal feels new, and so that's both exciting and scary.
It's accelerating very quickly after years of utter stagnation, and I think that's why it feels so jarring.
Yeah.
Speaking of RTD's savviness and canniness, as you mentioned earlier, should we get onto Costumegate to wrap? That's the last thing, isn't it?
Yeah. So, like we've all talked about and thought about, it's interesting that it's happened once before, but it never really happens that a Doctor's clothes regenerate and change too. Like, sometimes I'll change the fit, it won't be literally the same costume, but generally this doesn't happen. And so for Jodie's clothes to flare away and become Tennant's new outfit was noticeable. And I know some of us thought it was felt like a little bit of a, not saying intentionally, but it felt a little bit of a erasure. Like, I know a lot of fans really love getting to see the new Doctor in the old Doctor's outfit. It's like a fun little connectivity thing. We all love seeing Tennant in the jacket that was too big on him from Eccleston, or we love seeing Capaldi in Matt's clothes. It's a big fun thing. So some people felt a bit robbed of that. And to me, for whatever reason it was done, I thought maybe this was just a production reason, or maybe it was they just didn't want the imagery of it or whatever. It seems like a statement to just literally melt away everything that was the 13th Doctor and have the fully formed 14th Doctor presented to us. And I don't think we were overreading things to try and suss out the intentions of that, because everyone's pretty open in Doctor Who magazine about what happened there. So Russell, in the magazine, says, "I was very certain that I didn't want David to appear in Jodie's costume. I think the notion of men dressing in women's clothes, the notion of drag, is very delicate. I'm a huge fan of that culture and the dignity of that. It's truly a valuable thing, but it has to be done with immense thought and respect. With respect to Jodie and her Doctor, I think it can look like mockery when a straight man wears her clothes. To put a great big 6-foot Scotsman into them looks like we're taking the mickey. Also, I guarantee you it's the only photograph some of the papers would print for the rest of time. If they can play with gender in a sarcastic or critical way, they will. We could have the Doctor dressed as a knight, or dressed as God, or dressed as William Hartnell, and the only photo they'd print would be of David in what they considered to be women's clothes. Then it becomes weaponized as a mockery of feminine traits, a mockery of drag, of that culture. So that was never going to happen. Knowing that David was coming in, I was absolutely certain that the clothes would regenerate. Nothing would have changed my mind." Before we say our opinions, what opinions have you seen from other people regarding all this stuff? Because I've seen a lot of them swirling around.
The whole spectrum, I think. Ranging from "this is an outrage, RTD must go" sort of thing, and about how he's erasing Jodie, and he's being narrow-minded or regressive or insulting male cosplayers of Jodie's outfit. And then at the other end of the spectrum, people saying, "Oh, this is absolutely the right thing to do because, look how toxic the British press is, look how toxic their reporting on trans issues and gender and so on is. He's absolutely right that this is what would happen." I feel like those are probably the two poles, would you say? I don't know.
Yeah.
And then there's people who are maybe a bit in the middle, a bit conflicted, or sort of lean one way or the other, but not as strongly.
I mean, I've seen some more extreme claims that RTD's being transphobic, even, or something like that. Just somehow as bigoted as the people he's criticizing in that piece. So yeah,
I just have whiplash from a showrunner being so open and really matter of fact and practical about the reasons behind big creative decisions like that. That's really interesting. When he says, "I think it can look like mockery when a straight man wears her clothes," I understand people taking that badly, because a lot of men have dressed up as the 13th Doctor, and I think wouldn't like the notion that it looks like a joke if they do that, which I totally respect, and I think there's loads of people that have dressed up in that costume that I don't think it looks like a joke or anything. There is an elephant in the room, though, which is that it's not like costumes are an interchangeable, arbitrary thing. 13's costume does look a certain way, and you can't just compare each costume to another costume. Most Doctor costumes are they're a bit overdressed, and there's some really silly elements to them, but they you can dress them down a bit, and, in some contexts, the Doctor will look a little overdressed, and some will look a little underdressed, but he can generally blend in, sort of, with a lot of spectrums of, human society. 13's outfit, whatever the matter of taste, I think looks a little more costumey than most. The 6th Doctor was similar in that it looks more like a costume than, Doctors who can dress up and down a bit, like the 10th, the 12th, the 4th, the 2nd, the 1st. How do you guys assess the costume?
Most Doctors' costumes have kind of been in some form or another a suit. I think Eccleston's is maybe an outlier because he's got the t-shirt and stuff. But even then, he has the big bomber jacket, like World War I and whatever. I think 13's really stands out because she's got that coat that seems to serve no purpose other than to be that coat. if you see what I mean, there's not. I guess the thing is, the way gender comes into it is that suits, even though suits are kind of male coded, even though obviously we see women in suits all the time, I think to a certain extent, like just because of the history of, I guess, how that fashion has evolved, there is a huge sort of I also generally in culture, I think stuff that's male coded tends to get treated as gender neutral because there isn't that same level of misogynist scrutiny of them because they're associated with men. So like you can see it's so normalized for women to wear suits, for example. Whereas a man in a dress, suddenly you get like a whole level of like, terrorism like unloaded upon them. With 13's costume, even though it doesn't have anything that is overtly like this is female coded or whatever, but I think by dint of not being like, I guess, the usual maybe suit, like because I think we've seen Whittaker wearing Capaldi's costume, for example, and we've seen her wearing that suit in Spyfall as well. And when you look at those in comparison to her main costume, something feels very different. I think just by virtue of feeling so different and being kind of camp, being kind of and being, as you say, costumey in an almost Sixth Doctor kind of way, I think it really announces itself. It's a really significant visual symbol of, I guess, the idiosyncrasies of the Chibnall era, in a way, in the nicest way of phrasing it. And I guess maybe when RTD talks about how it feels like mockery or whatever to sort of put Tennant in it or something, maybe there are things he's not saying. I don't know. I don't want to try and psychoanalyze his response. But yeah, I think it's hard to say. I think to a certain extent, it's very characteristic of him to be that media conscious, especially with print media.
Yeah.
At the same time, I wonder if it's quite risk averse by his standards, because arguably with all this horrible sexist and homophobic coverage in the press all the time, maybe there's an opportunity to take the lead and to be brave and just stare him down and say, hey, fuck it, we're putting 10 in 13's costume.
Yeah.
Who cares? Everyone knows that's how regeneration works. Let's just do it. Who cares what they say? It doesn't matter. But at the same time, to back away from doing that, say no. You could say, okay, maybe he's playing it really safe, maybe unusually safe, and maybe people are like right to be disappointed that he didn't take more risks there. But at the same time, maybe he just didn't want to put his lead actor in that costume. Who can say?
Yeah, there's the question of whether he privately doesn't like the taste of it or not of that particular costume. It's not to his taste. There's also something which doesn't really been talked about that much, which is that he specifically points out the size differential. The fact that Tennant is so tall, and that he would kind of look silly in this her costume because he's such a tall man, compared to Dawan, obviously in The Power of the Doctor, wearing it where he's much shorter, much more slight kind of frame, and perhaps doesn't look as kind of quote marks silly. And that hasn't maybe been discussed quite as much, the size scaling up that would be involved.
I nonetheless think that the really, I guess, the outrage and sort of frustration around not doing the costume handover, I think it's more frustration from people not getting the thing they wanted than it is an actual response to material harm being done in that not happening. Because, but by and large, I mean, we did know after Power of the Doctor Ed that it feels like a little bit of a kick in the teeth, almost mean-spirited, to just have her clothes burn away in the way that they did. But at the same time, I think in terms of it really being like some huge slight against, cosplayers or women or like people, or gender non-conforming people, I think it's probably more people just trying to vocalize that nameless like disappointment they feel that they didn't get kind of the nice handover that maybe has become tradition.
I think he's about to have a trans actor in the show in a big way in Our New Rose. I think he's wanting to. I don't think he wants anything that could interfere with how that's going to end up presented. Like I've seen this suggested on Twitter that if you had Tennant in women, literally women's clothes, we can argue, to what extent they're feminine or not, Jodie's outfit. But if you had him in women's clothes, and there were scenes with him next to Rose, Our New Rose, that it's not like some papers wouldn't equivocate or, try and do something ugly with that. Like, there's a lot, RTD is so media conscious. I thought this is a really good point I saw online, that he knows the kind of things that the British press might do about this kind of imagery, and to completely take that out of the equation and off the board, it is quite brusque the way he's done that. But I think he's kind of perhaps nipped it in the bud, or, completely eliminated certain possibilities in a way that is mindful and respectful, some would argue. So I can understand feeling betrayed or frustrated by being denied that joy of, the costume handover.
And the material harm that is done to some fans thinking, oh, this isn't quite the way that it's always been, is obviously far less than, the potential material harm that could have been done if, as he says, transphobic press had run with all these, If
Russell was just saying, the transphobic press might stir stuff up, so that's why we didn't do it. And then if he didn't have any, trans stuff coming into the show afterwards, I think that would be a bit weirder.
Yeah.
But the fact that he's got stuff coming very soon down the pipeline there makes his concerns there feel more like it's makes more sense that he's trying to do something there.
I suppose there's also the fact that when the Doctor regenerates and they're still wearing the old Doctor's clothes, it's not those aren't the clothes that they want to be wearing, in a sense. They are put into those clothes when they appear as the new Doctor. Like, it's not a conscious choice on their part to wear that stuff, if you see what I mean. It's something that they just wake up and they're in it, and they're like, oh, okay, I better change out of this and put on something else eventually. So it's like, it's that thing of it being thrust on the character rather than a conscious decision to dress like that, if you see what I mean. That also plays a role, I think, in I think RTD might have had that in mind, in having it be, in how he might be portraying the idea of dressing in a woman's clothes as something that's like almost, I think there's a risk of it coming off as something that's being played for laughs, and he wouldn't have wanted that at all, if you see what I mean. Absolutely not.
And it's not even just a gender thing. Like, it is funny a lot of the times to see, I think Capaldi looked fine in Matt's clothes, but Tennant to me looked funny in Eccleston's jacket just because it hung off him, in a funny way. It was too big for him. It didn't fit. That was an amusing visual. I think because of the size differential and because of the different tone of the outfits, a lot of people would find it funny to see Tennant in Jodie's outfit. And a lot of people, would like that in a nice way. A lot of fans, wanted it to be a bit of a funny thing and would have enjoyed that, or, just thought it would be a cool visual. But I can understand why he's trying to avoid that. I don't think it's, whether you think he's made the right move or not, he doesn't seem motivated by transphobia to me, given how he's framed it here.
I think, put simply, he's drawing a really hard line and not allowing the context of Chibnall to really influence his stuff at all.
Yeah.
Just by having all signifiers of it just melt away like that. I mean, I suppose the old TARDIS is in the comic, but again, it's just a comic, isn't it? So,
if there's any last thing to say, my last thought would just be, I've seen a lot of people upset or still thinking that, hey, maybe Capaldi's not going to be in the 60th specials, but surely Matt will be, because specials are when we get Doctors together. Anniversaries are where we bring the Doctors together. That's the idea. It's when we get eras interacting. And that's another way where, people are saying, oh, bringing Tennant back is, it's nostalgic and it's just looking to the past and, it's inert. But anniversaries where you're not bringing past Doctors back into orbit with each other is newish. Like, New Who's anniversaries in general tend to bring, Doctors together. The 50th did it. The centenary did it. For the 60th anniversary to not be having Doctors from different eras interacting with each other is also new and therefore novel and different, which I think is really cool, because God knows I am burnt out on multi-Doctor stuff. I've had enough for a while. The EU churns them out like nobody's business. If you want to gorge on them, the comics are there. The audios are doing all sorts of ways to do them these days. And the TV show, I think, is done enough for a while.
I actually think it'd be a bit more disrespectful to Smith and Capaldi just to have done the normal thing, of let's say, I don't know, either Jodie staying on or Ncuti's first story being the special, and Tennant just comes back as the old favourite kind of thing, a bit like in Day of the Doctor. I think that would have been more of sending more of a signal of kind of, oh, we bring back the familiar sort of, slightly flanderized version of himself, one that you like, but not the others. Yeah. Whereas this isn't doing that. This is, as we've been talking about, this is something completely kind of unknown by virtue of its familiarity. So
yeah.
fans are so like addicted to the ritual of the anniversary and stuff. You know, they're using it as a crutch. They're just sucking on that teat all the time. You know, they haven't acclimatized to the idea that anything new can be done. That's a really bad habit that Doctor Who fans have. They just get so used to the ritual and the pomp and circumstance of one thing being like this every time that they can't like open their minds a little bit to things being different and new.
They become the Time Lords.
Yeah.
I think of it the same way, like I was talking earlier about, like, no one's been robbed of anything. Everyone's gotten enough of all the Doctors here. Like, we just had the Centenary, which, you know, had loads of Doctors in it, and we got to see them all again, and it even had David Bradley in it again. We've had the 50th, we've had Twice Upon a Time, like, and there's constant EU ones. I don't think we're being robbed of. I know people feel robbed of seeing Eccleston and Capaldi back again, but that's not
down to us. They're not doing it because they don't want to do it. It's that simple.
We're not owed that. Yeah. First of all, I think they both did enough. Eccleston did an incredible series, you know, 13 full episodes. And now if you love Eccleston, he's doing more stuff over on audio too. There's that if you want to access that as well. Capaldi, like I've said, he's done more than enough. He's done loads and loads of Doctor Who, including a multi-Doctor special. So those two are off the board, and we're not owed infinite appearances from Doctors. That they do their contracts for what they do, and they've done them, and we got plenty from them, and it was really, really good. We're not owed any more of them. If they want to come back and there's a good story for it, great, but we're not owed that. You can't expect that, as I think Capaldi's trying to make it clear. And we've gotten Tennant back, you know, obviously in lots of ways. Matt had the 50th, and, you know, I dare say we'll see him in an anniversary one day. He loves the show. I don't think that's crazy that we'll see him again. I don't feel like it's something we need, and I think if you always do it just for the ritual, like Gig said, it loses its luster and magic. The way I think Regenerations and the whole Doctor Telos sequencing stuff kind of have. So I think it's a nice, refreshing thing to make an anniversary not what we think of as an anniversary. I think the few times that the show or the EU does this, it can end up more memorable than regular anniversaries. I think of Zagreus, the 40th anniversary audio, which it's not a regular Doctors interacting with each other type thing, and it's much more memorable for that because it does something weird with the anniversary concept instead. So I think this idea of the 60th anniversary being, well, we're getting some old actors back, but it's in this weird new way, and it's not a multi-Doctor thing. Because it's pretty clear by now it's not a multi-Doctor thing. You know, people are saying no, and there's no sign of Matt, who's off busy doing other stuff. I think it's very clear at this point. It's Tennant as a new Doctor. It's not a fan wank Doctors interacting with each other. You redecorated type thing. That's not what is going on, which is new, which is exciting.
Yeah, I've got nothing to add. Yep.
Well, just one little thing from Doctor Who magazine. It mentions that the teeth line in 14's first scene was Tennant's contribution, which I think fair play to him, because that's the better line in the scene by far, and I hope he continued to have creative input, because he's clearly having very good instincts.
And so that concludes our chat about the first 14th Doctor story and these other issues that are swirling around these early days of RTD2, Russell T Davies' second era as Who showrunner. I would, of course, as usual, love to hear anyone else's thoughts on these topics and on the comic as well. There's a bunch of fascinating stuff to think about with this era, especially at this early stage now. So please feel free to share your thoughts, and thank you again for listening in. Cheers.